And hello, folks. We are here. You wouldn't believe the travails we've been through, but here we are indeed.
And let's just make sure that we have gotten through them all. So if you can give us a thumbs up, that way sound is coming through and video is coming through, that would be great.
Yeah, anyone who is watching, if you give us a message at the moment, we don't appear to have any viewers, Rob, but let's...
We had 5, now we've got 2. We must have scared them off. Yeah.
Oh, okay. Cool.
Anyway,
okay.
we're Totally Tanked, the Tankies podcast in Tanksville. It's May 18th, 2024, and this is episode 58. My name is Rob, and I'm joined by...
Hello, I am John. I hope. I believe I am. Yes. Okay. And we are talking today about the Renault FT.
Yes, aka the FT-17, the French tank, the Fabial Tonnage or reduced weight tank, the Victory tank, Le Char, la Victoire, the mother of tanks. Also, we're also going dipping our toes into the USA M1917, the Italian Fiat 3000, and the Russian Renault, and anyone else who's made a Renault FT and gave it their own name.
Now, the Russian Renault, it should be noted, was written Renoe.
Yes.
Yeah, not
Renault. They made up their own
Renault.
spelling, so...
Yeah. That's lovely. But and that was a complicated heritage because the White Russians had them first, and then the communists said, "Oh, we like the look of these."
Yes. Well, no, because they took the ones. Anyway, we'll get into that.
We'll get to that.
All right.
It's all coming.
Patrons.
Patrons, yes. Okay, so we're going to do something super clever here, Rob. We've got a special video just for them. And we can keep talking while that's going, except I've gone to the wrong bit. So
John has new technology.
Oh, no.
That's looking okay.
Except it's started at the wrong place. Oh, no. Wow. This was working brilliantly. Okay, there we go. Oof.
Right. Now, Artificer patrons: Brian Jenkins, Chris Pezze, Cornelius Weber, Ian McGuinness, Jonathan A. Markle, Maxi Mixed and Per, and our other lovely apprentice patrons: Anton Gorbanoff, Carter Heller, Christoph Keller, Dan Sapineza, David Mulvaney, Floaty Bird, Gihuk, Hans Wang, Henry Hammerreed, Jay Beckman Strauss, Jamie Stokes, Late Apex, Major Mansfield, Scotch 12, Spencer Davis, Steve Matthews, Vikram Murthy.
That's it. Vikram's the last one.
There we go. And
yes.
the first.
All right, and we'll just let those continue scrolling across the screen in exactly the way it's meant to, which is lovely. And just do want to note, it's really awesome that people do come on board for the Patreon. We do appreciate the money, and it pays for new bits of tech. And okay, t-shirts. We've been joined by Ken from California, former US Army tanker. So we're talking about the very first US Army tank, Ken. So I hope you enjoy. All right, let's put us back on the screen.
So if you want an excellent Totally Tanked t-shirt, beer coaster, coffee mug or cool hat, head over to redbubble.com and search for Totally Tanked. Time to get into the tank.
Yeah, just quickly, seeing as we've got a couple of people on the line, can you let us know if we're sounding and looking okay? Because it's been very stressful getting it all set up this time.
The last couple of months have not, the last couple of episodes, things have been happening.
Technical difficulties with StreamYard. Well, there's 5 of them, so that's good. Okay, moving on. Rob, what more do we want to say about...
Well, you wanted to talk about, so what the hell is a Renault FT?
Yes. Okay. So in the US, it was documented at times as FT, standing for French tank. It's one of those things that's a backronym in the Renault factory. When they were building new vehicles, they just gave them 2-letter codes, and FT was just the next code that was available. It didn't stand for anything.
Thank you, Alexander Vlad. We love your work.
Yeah. Okay, we look and sound great. That's the most important thing. Okay, so the FT was just the next initial available as a 2-letter code for a project in the Renault factory.
So the previous one had been the FS, so this one's an FT.
I don't even know if it was... I don't know what the previous one was. It was just whatever code system they had, it went to FT.
Tasman.
Hey, Tasman. Okay, and so that's... And there was this whole thing in 1916, SDN, who's a legendary figure in French armour, was heavily involved in French armour into World War II, came to Louis Renault, who we'll talk more about him later, but was an absolute genius and titan of industry, and said, "Can you design a tank?" And Renault said, "Those things don't sound very interesting to me.
I'm a car maker."
Yeah, I'm a car maker. Why would I do that? And then, as far as I can tell, basically Renault looked at the terrible job everyone else was doing making tanks and said, "Okay, I'll do it."
G'day, Brett. Thanks for joining us. So we'll get on to more about the origin of how he got into it and so forth, and we'll just go through
the details. I mean,
stats.
Also, let's cover now the reason why it's so significant, and the reason why we called it the mother of tanks is simply that it was the first tracked tank with a turret for the main armament, a fully traversing turret for the main armament. Yes, there had been turrets on other things, but this was the one that put it on the tracks. And it also had the first time where they said, "Hey, you know what? We should separate the engine compartment from the crew."
So they give them all carbon monoxide.
Which is seems obvious now, and a lot of Renault's innovations seem obvious now, but he was the first one to do them. So that's part of the influence of this tank and why it was so important for tank development. The other thing that I find cool about it, Rob, is it looks a lot like a Warhammer 40k Dreadnought, one of the old model ones, with a little slit for the driver. And when you see the pictures of the hatches open and the driver in there, they're kind of entombed in there. That's one for the 40k nerds. Cool. Cat Chance joined us from Montana. Late night stream for you. Thanks for joining us. Cool. Hey, this is working, Rob. We've got people watching.
Nobody's complaining about the sound of the video.
Everyone seems to think it looks
all right. Some stats, some great stats. The Renault. So we'll start off with the Renault FT. So we'll go through, as I said, a few of these tanks because they're all basically the same, with a few minor changes. All right. So the Renault FT produced from 1917 to 1919. So finished in August 1919. The French built around 3,000, somewhere between 2,600 and 3,000. 6.5 tons, 5 meters long. 1.74 metres wide, 2.14 metres high, so 7 feet. Crew of 2, a commander, and who was also the loader, gunner, and everything else, and the driver.
Look, I feel with this one that it was more... I mean, in theory, the commander could kick the driver in bits of his back to give him orders, but it was kind of like the tank was wrapped around the driver and the person in the turret was just there to go dakka dakka at people. And it was mostly dakka dakka because it was initially, primarily a machine gun carrier.
It had anywhere between 8 mils on the hull up to 22 mils on the reconditioned turret. They started out at 16 mils on the turret, and then they got a little bit thicker. The main armament was the Puteaux. I want to say it's the 37 mil gun, or short-barreled gun, or the 8mm Hotchkiss machine gun.
Now the 37mm is kind of interesting because people are kind of down on it, saying, "Oh, it wasn't that good a gun," and then the high explosive round was only equivalent to a modern, underbarrel grenade launcher. But that's a hell of a weapon in 1917.
Yeah, it's the fact that they then took out 1,000 of these and then put them in the Somoirs 20 years later. That
Somoir R35 used the same gun, yeah.
Well, this is where they got them from. They took out 1,000 of these to put in those because they couldn't be bothered building something else, I guess.
I really do wonder what the point of the R35 was, given that it had similar armour and the same weapon. Much better engine, I imagine, but... this was literally ahead of its time, which is why it saw significant service in World War II.
All right, engine's got a Renault 4-cylinder, 4-litre petrol engine, producing 39 huge horsepower, 4 speeds forward, 1 reverse, 95 litres of fuel capacity, operational range of 60 kilometres, and maximum speed of a whopping 7 kilometres an hour.
Which does make you realise, because for those on the video, we've got a lot of slides of this thing bursting out of trenches. And if it was doing that at 7 kilometres an hour, it wouldn't have been half as impressive as it looks in a still photo.
Now, Cornelius von Becky, thanks for joining us.
Corny, yep.
Is that Cornelius?
Yeah.
Right, yes, lovely.
Who went to Windrose last night and didn't invite me.
John's
very salty.
Diggy hole. I didn't go either. Anyway, and for those who have seen the front idler wheel, it's made of wood. So
it's incredible.
Yep.
It's just incredible because it's like, oh, how are we going to disable this tank? It's like, well, shoot at that wheel. It's not going to stand up to nothing.
It is. Well, it's 2 inches of probably French white oak.
I believe it's laminated, so essentially plywood, but it was before plywood was plywood. But they painted it so it looked like it was metal, but it was, to save weight, it was actually wooden. And it's the huge front.
Was it the way, or was they just couldn't actually build a wheel that large for what they were after?
I think they could build a wheel that large, but I believe weight was the saving they were trying to make, and it was a huge front idler because this was a trench crosser. That was the context it was built for, and then it needed that weird little ducktail on the back, which every time you see them actually exiting trenches is doing a lot of work. But for what it was meant to do, it was designed extremely well because Louis Renault, we'll talk about what a bastard he was, but he was a very smart man.
And one of the other fun ones I found out about, for lubrication of the running gear, the running wheels along the tracks were also hollow, and they were stuffed with horsehair and then filled with oil, so that the oil would slowly leak out onto the running gear and keep everything lubricated as you went around.
That's the sort of engineering you get from the days of horse carriages, isn't it?
Pretty much.
Yeah.
So, right. You don't have any. Your oils and lubricants weren't all that up to speed for mechanical devices. So
well, they're all learning.
Yeah.
I have thought before that if there was one tank you wanted to send back in time to say, I don't know, win the Punic Wars for Hannibal. The Renault FT would be it, because it would be modern enough to be effective, but it is simple and primitive enough that with a good chemistry textbook, ancient people could possibly keep it running for a while.
Yeah, kerosene and probably runner. Yeah, keep it going.
Hmm.
All right, then we quickly move on to the USA M1917, 950 built. They made theirs slightly bigger with 7.22 tons. Now,
I mean, it did have to fit Americans in it, didn't it?
Yes. Well, now this is the important point. They wanted it a little bit bigger and stronger and better for it. All right. So it was, rather than 5 meters, it was 16 feet 5 inches. It was 5 foot 10 inches wide.
Are these measurements exactly the same as the metric ones?
7 foot 7 inches high. And I had to make that point because the US had issues with the metric measurements given to them by the French.
Still do.
So they made sure to convert their M1917 tank to imperial units. Right, so they said, bugger this metric stuff.
Did they change over the nuts and bolts to 5/8 of an inch and that sort of thing?
Don't tell me about 5/8 of an inch. I had my own troubles trying to find a 5/8 of an inch bolt in Bunnings is freaking impossible.
Yeah.
And yet they sell 5/8 inch threaded metal rods. And
yep.
saying, well, that's the metal rod for it.
Yeah.
Where's the bolt?
Where's the bolt? Where's the nut? The nut. The nut. Yes.
Yeah, sorry.
We know the difference between nuts and bolts. You're a logistician. Yeah.
All right. Okay. It also had a main armament of a 37mm gun, which they call the M1916. Or the M1917 machine gun, which was then later replaced by the M1919 Browning machine gun, which is the US 30 cal. Now, the other month we were talking about 100 years of the 50 cal. We're actually wrong. It's actually the 100 years of the 30 cal. The M1919 is the 30 cal.
Right.
The M250 cal came into service in 1933, so we got that wrong the other month.
Okay, all right.
But the M19, the 30 cal is still in use. It ended production in 1945, but it's still out there in the world and being used.
I always wondered what the point of the 30 cal was. I mean, the Americans were mad for it. It was used in an enormous number of vehicles, but to have another ammo type that the infantry don't use and that the...
a lot of them got converted over to 7.62 or the 303 or 30-06 type, their standard rounds, so that's what they were using.
Yeah, but it was just an interesting intermediate round that never seemed to actually have a real purpose, and yet... there it was. Yep.
All right. There's their engine now is 42 horsepower. Same again for forward gears.
Isn't that less than the French one? I thought it was 38.
No, the French was 39.
Oh, yeah, and this one's 42. Okay, 42.
Yep. 4 forward speeds, 1 reverse. 30 US gallons. They could only go 30 miles on road, and they had a maximum speed of 5.5 miles per hour. So a little bit better than the 7 k's an hour. All right, so then the Italian Fiat 3000 Model 21, or as they like to say, Prosecco is far better than champagne.
That's where, because in the pictures in the slideshow for those on the video, there was talk of FT21s, and I was wondering how that could be if they were finished in 1919. But now it all makes sense. That's an FT21.
Yes.
Cool.
Well, it's a Fiat Model 3000.
Sure.
Sorry,
Okay.
Fiat 3000 Model 21. So, 1,400 were ordered in 1918 to be built under the FT license, but they didn't end up, they weren't produced until 1921 with a slightly different Italian design. They were in service from 1921 to 1945. They only built 152. They went slightly lighter. They were only 6-ton mass, 4.2 meters, 29 meters long, 1.6 meters wide, and 2.2 meters high. So it's slightly tiny little bit higher, but much shorter. Crew of 2, and there being 1 ton lighter, or half a ton lighter. Slightly less armour because they didn't up armour the turrets like the French did afterwards. They started out with the main armament of 2 6.5mm machine guns. And when they went to their cannon version, they had a 37mm gun, but they also included in there the coax 6.5mm machine gun, making it the first turreted tank with a main gun and a machine gun mounted in the turret at the same time. So where there had been plenty of tanks like the Mark IVs and the French Charmant and so forth that had machine guns and cannons, they weren't in turrets and they weren't all happening at the same time.
Yeah, it's an interesting point in this moment of the evolution of the tank, because from a planner's point of view, they would be like, okay, we'll have some with machine guns and some with cannon, and then they'll be traveling together, and if they need a machine gun, the one with the machine gun can do the job. And to make the jump to say, hey, it makes a lot more sense to have everything in the one package.
Of course, the the commander, loader, gunner has a bit more work to do when he's got 2 guns to look after.
Yeah, but he's just looking through his tiny little vision slits and going daka daka daka.
And salute to you too, Mehdi.
Yes.
Welcome. Thanks for joining the chat.
And thank you, Mehdi, for saying nice things about my George Patton video in the from the last episode. Yes, we got criticised. And thank you, Half-Life APC, for joining us.
Saying such nice things about us.
Yeah.
Right. It had a crew of 2, as per previously. It had a Fiat 4-cylinder 50 horsepower engine, so much.
Wow.
Yeah,
a whole 50 horsepower.
That's right. It had a range of 100
Which,
kilometers.
as we know, there's 8 horsepowers to a real horse. But anyway.
I thought it was 18.
No, just 8, I think.
There you go. It had a range of 100 kilometres and a maximum speed of a whopping 21 kilometres per hour.
Now, I reckon that
lightning fast.
That track system would be starting to have some real stress at that sort of speed.
Yeah. There's some great videos of Mussolini's fascists running these FTs off, the Fiats off the back of trucks, taking them through the paces, running over men who were lying down in front of it, and the men jumping up afterwards and saying how grand this all stuff is, and basically having a huge crowd for coming along to watch.
I want to know who the volunteer was to do that the first time. I mean, 8 ton. It's
6 ton.
Yeah, I mean 6 ton. It's a lot. Like you wouldn't want it dropped on your foot. But
the thing is that
the track does spread the load.
Yeah, well, no, they weren't running over them. They were lying down in front of it, and basically the tracks were going either side of them as they were getting run over.
All right, that makes a lot more sense. Cat Chan saying the tracks look flimsy. It's an old design that's based on the old Holt tractors, which are the real grandfathers of the tank.
But they still rip up pavement really well. Seeing modern videos of them being manoeuvring.
Well, you can see on some of the pictures of modern ones that are still in use, they've got rubber grousers bolted onto them. Yep. But it was an old track way of making tracks, single pin, not great, but better than nothing. And I mean, the French were still using terrible tracks like this pretty much into World War II with the Chars and the Chabis and the Sommers.
Yeah. All right, then we'll jump into the Russian Renault. They built anywhere between 15 and 17. Basically, theirs was 7 tons. Basically, it was a French FT, but they put in a 37mm Hotchkiss naval gun. Their first one was made with the French 37mm Puteaux. But then they put in a Hotchkiss naval gun. Then they ended up putting in a secondary armament of the Hotchkiss M1909 Benet Merci machine gun, chambered in 303 British rounds.
Oh, yep.
But that wasn't always present in the tanks. Their armour was the same as the French, between 6 mils and 22 mils. 34 horsepower engine. So they were putting Fiat truck engines in their tanks because they were being recovered tanks. They weren't quite the same engines. They weren't quite the same.
They would have been quite small trucks, but that was the spirit of the time.
Yeah.
Yep.
So basically, the Russians had Fiat truck engines available to them, so that's what they're putting in. Range of 60 kilometres, speed of 8.5 kilometres.
Which model is this again, sorry?
This is the Russian Renault.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, so...
Rusky Renault.
Yes,
Yeah.
yes. They were built from captured white Russian FTs that were pulled apart and then put back together again in order to learn how tanks worked in 1919 as part of the Russian Civil War. The first were captured near Odessa with the messages sent back to army headquarters. The enemy, Greek and French volunteers, was driven out of forward positions and in confusion fled in complete disarray. Within a few minutes we captured a lot of war material, about 100 machine guns, 4 artillery pieces, 2 of them long range, 7 locomotives and an armoured train, 4 tanks and 2 headquarters, 1 Greek and 1 French. And basically those tanks were then sent back and rather than employed straight away on the front lines, they were sent back to be studied, pulled apart and put back together again.
And I just want to note, we've talked about this before, but we'll talk about it again. The Russian Civil War, no one likes to talk about it because the Western powers lost, and the Western powers were engaged in a huge way.
Yeah,
there were
from the west to
thousands
to
and
north
thousands
to
of
the east.
Australians, Americans, British. I think something like 6 Victoria Crosses were awarded to Australians in the conflict, which marks out as a very big war for us. And there's a significant number of dead on the walls of the war memorial from it. Even though this is one of the funny ones with the way they count the dead at the war memorial. Technically, they had left Australian service and re-enlisted in British service to go in the Russian expedition, but for some reason we decided we'd honour their names in our war shrine, but we do not honour the cooks on board HMAS Sydney.
That was HMAS Sydney, for those don't know, was sunk.
Yeah.
On its way. Anyway.
Yeah, sunk with all hands, and the cooks received no honour because apparently they weren't warlike service enough.
Did anyone tell Steven Seagal?
Oh yeah, well,
I'm just the cook. Yeah, for those anyway, so another telegram was also sent to the white military commander, governor of Odessa, demanding the unconditional surrender of the city, or else the governor would be skinned alive and his skin fashioned into a drum. I just thought I'd include that in there because that's just wonderful imagery to send to your enemies. So the first tank to be built by the Russians was called Freedom Fighter Comrade Lenin, because they couldn't decide what to name it, and they said some of it was saying freedom, the other ones were saying Freedom Fighter, and the other one was saying Comrade Lenin. So they said, you know what, we'll just put them all together and call it Freedom Fighter Comrade Lenin. And that was the first Russian Renault off the out of the factory.
Yeah, we've just got some questions, particularly from Mehdi, asking about what's the point of these tanks and smaller tanks. Basically, my understanding is that Louis Renault, having been said, can you build a tank, went and looked at the horrible Schneider tanks that the French were building at the time and the pretty bad British Mark IVs, and said, hang on, if what we want is to cross trenches in broken, muddy ground, making it heavier and heavier is a counterproductive way to go about that. And what's the point of having guns pointing in all directions when we can just have one good gun pointing in one direction at a time?
I think the one good gun came about because he said, with the engines we've got, it can be no more than 7 tons.
Yes.
7 tons is your limit, and that's what he built to, because that's all the engines he had available to him could usefully do anything with. And said, okay, so we've got a small vehicle then, and what do we do with that? Okay, if we can't have guns pointing in every direction, well, we put it in turret. And it was the turret was just well built, built on ball bearings, and it was manoeuvred by the commander inside. He had some handles to hold onto, and he just he would sit in a sling. There was no seat for him. He had a leather strap sling to sit on.
Look, the French at the time thought little slings were an okay way for people to sit, and the idea that people would be days at a time in missions in these things was not in anyone's sense of what they were building them for. So it's part of an evolution, and it was fine for the time. I think there's just, a big issue to bear in mind is that the idea that does a tank have lots of guns pointing in different directions. The Independent in the interwar years, the Russian tank before the T-34, the idea of having land ships with turrets pointing in lots of directions was still alive and well into the late 1930s. But fundamentally, and warships have actually followed this, most warships these days only have one main gun. The idea that you invest everything in the one gun and you actually make sure it can hit what it's aiming at and it delivers the lethal blow with that one hit, that has won out over time, over lots of weapons pointing in lots of directions.
Question from Brett was, how did it stack up against the British Whippet?
Better.
I think neither one was all that fast, but it was much smaller and lighter. So
I'd also just say count the export orders.
Yes.
People wanted the FT, and because after the post-war period, trench warfare. Admittedly, everyone was still thinking they were going to fight trench warfare again, but it wasn't like the gridlock over the Somme and Passchendaele that this was built for. It remained useful even outside of that context. And
yes, while you could put a stripper pole on a Bob Sample Alexander Vlad, at least it had a mattress in there already, so you're all set to go.
That's right. The crew just sat on the mattresses in the Sample.
You lay on a mattress to fire the machine gun. Mm-hmm. All right. Okay, John, you want to talk about why it is the mother of tanks and not, as some would say, Little Willie or Mother or any other?
Look, I mean, I think we've covered this a little bit already, but it's the fundamental turret, main gun, separated engine compartment that really makes it stand out as being the progenitor of modern tanks, as opposed to the first fighting vehicle with tracks, because as we know, there are many sorts of fighting vehicles with tracks that aren't tanks. And while you can't take that away from the British Marks 1 through 4 that they are tanks, because literally they were built and called tanks, they would not be called tanks in modern terminology, whereas the Renault FT would.
Yes, even though it's called a Shah.
Yes, even though it's called a Shah.
All right, design and development. Now, I got to give credit to the man. Laserpig did a great video on the mess that was the French tank development and decisions leading into the FT. The generals in charge were saying, no, we don't want this little tank.
We want these big Goliaths, tanks, like the A7V and the British Mark IV.
And Renault had already said no. So then another general came along and said, look, do you really want to? Do you think you can really do this for us? And he said, I'll give it a go. But the Minister of Defence, or the equivalent of, said, no, we're not going to do that. He then went on a trip to Russia. While he was over there in Moscow, his 2IC turned around to Renault and the general who was promoting the FT and said, go ahead and do it. And he did. So Renault built some prototypes, and from that, when the minister came back, he sacked his 2IC, but everybody had looked at these two prototypes that were running around and said, they look pretty good. And then but he said, no, we're going to stick with the big tanks. We're going to stick with the heavy ones. How long are they going to be before they're in service? Oh, another year. Well, how long do we get these ones? Oh, 6 weeks.
Now remember as well, that's because Louis Renault was mass producing cars.
Yep.
So he was already set up to build lots of things.
Yeah.
And Louis Renault was basically the smartest guy in the room every day of his life. Would have been quite funny to hear. He must have met Henry Ford at some point to know what they thought of each other. But it would be quite funny. All these French being like, "Oh, we're just going to try and do what the British are doing." Louis Renault turning up with, "Here is the future. Do you want it?"
Yeah. So anyway, the point being is that the only reason we got it was because somebody's boss was away in Russia, and these 2IC made the decision for him, and it all went well from there. So that's how you got these swarms of light tanks to running around the battlefield, and they were very effective, more effective than the great big behemoths as they were coming around.
But we get to the same thing people are rediscovering in Ukraine right now. A heavier tank can't cross the bridges, get stuck in the mud, all these other things, and a lighter tank, if it can still perform the mission, which is a huge if, is always going to have huge advantages. The halftime show, which is coming up in a little while, is us talking to Peter Samsonov about the Tiger, because he's got a new book out, and just talking about, and we knew this already, but he's got really good sources, and makes the point about the logistical incompatibility with the huge Tiger with what the Germans had to try and support it in terms of engineering vehicles.
Yeah. So as I said, look, it's a great in-depth video by Laserpig on the mess that was the French tank development in the First World War. So go off and watch that at some stage.
Although, look, I love Laserpig. Like when he puts a new video out, I'm there on the first day to watch it. You've got to double check everything he says.
You've got to double check what we say.
True, but Laserpig's playing some games that I don't understand.
Anyway,
but,
the point being, okay, so I just love that, and this is, I mean, the way it happened. Anyway, some other interesting things about the actual tank itself. So it was done up in camo, as you can see in all the videos.
French camo, though.
French camo. There's no green, all right? So it should be light brown and browns. They did actually
quite a lot of green in the one that we took the
they're
photo
not
off at the
actually-
War
they're
Memorial.
not actually authentic. Then that's because black and white photos, black and white images, people added in the green. But when restorers went through old tanks and peeled back the layers of rust and everything else, they could see a chemical analysis on what the colours should be, and they said, "Yep, light brown and brown, and black, a little bit of black." Fun ones were the vision slits on for the driver and the commander.
I mean, the ones they drew on to draw the fire?
They would draw on fake vision slits in the light colours, so you could see them, and leave the actual actual vision slits. They were in the dark colours of the camo, so they were very clever with how they did, because it didn't stand out. You could definitely see the fake vision slits.
Look, the vision slit is one of those ideas that in 1916 they're like, how are we going to see out of this armoured box? Let's just make a little,
just like a night,
a little gap, like a knight's visor, except every knight who had those thin visors was only using that armour in tournament jousting. Battlefield armour for knights was much more open-faced, so they could see what was going on around them. And similarly, the vision slit was an idea that it made sense. Why not try it? These days, you'd be like, that is hopelessly inadequate for situational awareness. And then very quickly, enemy soldiers figured out that if they shoot at the vision slit, enough lead squeezes through to hurt people inside.
All right, Maddie, his question is a question about the Tiger, which is off topic, but I feel like answering it. Why, if they have superior engineering, if Germans' engineering was so superior, how could they have such a high mechanical failure rate? Simple answer is they designed a 45-ton tank and they made it 55 tons, 56 tons. That's
a big problem. Same with Panther's weight gain. The other one was just that the Germans didn't have helical cut gears. So their gearboxes in World War II with spur cut gears were much more prone to breakage than American gearboxes that were coming out of the car industry.
all right.
Yeah.
Back to the FT. So with our lovely ducktail on the back of it, you had to actually drop the tailpiece in order to hand crank start the tank, and then lift the tailpiece back into place and pin it into place. So,
but Rob, there was another way.
I know. There is. So that was how you. That was the simple way of doing it, because you had lots of room outside the tank, but you had to drop the ducktail.
Have you ever hand cranked a car?
Not for a look.
I think I was about 9 years old when I got given a lift by someone with a hand crank car, and had to. They showed me how to crank it, and it is absolutely terrifying, and you can break your arm really easily.
I remember doing something like it, but it wasn't a car. So anyway.
But again, this is Renault saying, "Oh, this is how we start." Renault's should be fine with the tank, and to the extent that it works, and you're never worried about flat batteries or having your air compressors full, it's quite functional. But there's videos on YouTube. If you're interested, look them up, of like the American GI Museum, I think.
That's exactly the one I'm talking about.
Doing starting up their Renault FT, and it's just like hand cranking any car. It's absolutely terrifying, and you can break your arm.
Yeah. But they did have a hand crank inside the tank as well. So if you stalled it in the middle of combat, you did not have to get outside your tank, drop the ducktail.
Except it's mechanically. Everyone who's looked at it and started an FT says it is almost impossible to use this thing inside that compartment.
You know what? Stress under fire is going to give
you can do a lot of things.
You can achieve a lot of things. the stress under fire. So, yeah, I reckon you'd be able to get it going if you're the commander standing there in your immobilised tank in the middle of no man's land, trying to get it going. All right.
Although jumping out the hatch at the back would be very tempting in that moment as well. All right, we finished the beer tube, which is Australia's averagest lager, the Victoria Bitter.
Yep. So we'll be moving on to the beer review beer that long. Because, logistics is obviously not our forte, but at this stage, today was a stressful day.
That's what you do professionally, isn't
it? All right, other bits and pieces. The cupola. It was like the Sommoir is for looking out of. It was not a hatch to climb out of. They had they had a hatch in the back, to be able to climb in and out, or actually feed in, pass in ammunition.
So speaking of the hatches, one final point for pop culture references. There's some of the photos we've got in the slideshow, and if you're listening to the podcast, it's on our social media. The slide deck will be up by the time you're hearing this. Those back hatches look very Macross.
Oh yes, if you open them up, okay, yeah, I can see that.
So and I imagine
for those who don't know, Macross is
from Robotech, but I imagine the Japanese, when they were doing Robotech, looked at some pictures and that went, oh, that's an interesting look.
Yep.
Yeah, they look kind of like wings, basically.
Yes,
but
yes. Yeah. All right. Each of the 4 cylinders of the engine had to be individually primed. They had a little cap on top of them that you could put fuel into. So that was just the technology of the time to prime the engine. The crankcase was aluminium, not a aluminum.
Okay, so the Carthaginians aren't going to be doing aluminium. I'll give you that. But as long as they don't break the case.
I'm assuming that was just done to save weight, so you could probably get away with a steel one.
But when you consider that so many tanks in World War II didn't have aluminium blocks, again, this comes down to just how far ahead of its time this tank was in so many ways.
Right. The other thing with Renault's production line was they built so many so fast they had no spare parts for repairs. So when they broke down, they had to get cannibalised, and eventually a third were returned to the depot to be used as spare parts. So basically, they're cranking them out in 1918, end of 1917, and they did not spend any time building the spare parts for them. They said, right, we're going to get the full tanks out.
Again, though, vehicles in war was something that mechanical vehicles in war was something that people really didn't have their heads around at this point. Remember that the Battle of Sedan, the French fought with taxis shuttling the troops to the front line. So there were lessons to be learned, and they learned them. But this was part of the process.
Yeah. One of the really important things about the FT was had good operational mobility, as you could just put them on the back of a truck and move them to wherever you needed, because as the heavier tanks either needed to be put on the back of railways or move through their own slow movement to where they needed to be, at which point they would probably need to be serviced when they got there. Whereas the FTs, you throw them on the back of a truck or a trailer and you can drive them to where you need them to be straight away and roll them off the back of the truck, and they're into battle. So there was that operational mobility meant that they could be where they needed to be, whereas the heavier, bigger tanks, there was a lot more logistical
you couldn't move them anywhere that the railway didn't go.
A lot more logistical baggage to get them to where they needed to be.
I mean, remember that pretty much outside of the US, very few countries had any trucks that could haul a load bigger than 5 ton, even into World War II.
The French were doing it, the Italians were doing it.
Yeah, well, sorry, let's say 10 ton then, but there were trucks were not what they are today. Yeah.
All right.
El Bobo's joined us. Hello. Okay, moving on.
Great. Conflicts. Wow, there was a lot. So we'll start off with just say. We'll go through the various tanks. So we'll start off the Renault FT. So World War One. What a surprise! The Russian Civil War.
And can we go back? Finish up with World War One. One of the interesting uses of it was British generals, particularly after the the German Spring Offensive in 1918, where the Germans probably didn't nearly win the war, but people thought they did for a while.
They got within 36 kilometres of Paris.
Yeah.
That was alarming for a lot for a war that had not moved in 4 years.
Yeah.
For the Germans to suddenly go, I think it was 56 kilometres or 34 kilometres, something like that, in one massive push.
Yeah.
And basically the only reason they stopped is because they'd gone so far.
Well, that and they were eating the American stores.
Yeah, they'd gone so far, they'd outrun all their logistical supplies, and they'd been told, okay, you're doing really well, keep on going. Because the plan had been to go one bound, And then when they got there, they said, "Oh, we're still winning." So they went a second bound. By that stage, they'd outrun all their supplies and couldn't go any further.
So a lot of things were happening there. One was simply that they were starving and they finally had access to Allied warehouses full of food, and they literally just refused to follow orders and ate the food. But an interesting one in terms of the Renault FT was that a lot of British commanders were killed. As in generals were killed. But there was a lot of shelling of pre-registered crossroads. So when the general in his staff car was rushing up to the front to find out what was happening, they'd get sniped by the German artillery at the crossroads. And so the British used the FT as a command vehicle, basically a little armoured sarcophagus for their generals to move them around the battlefield without being quite as vulnerable as they were in just an ordinary car.
Yeah, so the British only had they only used 24 of the French Renault FTs, and that were only for command and control and communication. So they would, as you're saying, run them around that. All right, the Russian Civil War, the Polish-Russian War. So Poland was not a state during the First World War. It was
the Grand Duchy of Warsaw as part of the Russian Empire.
That's the one. Mm-hmm. And so after the war, whereas it previously it was reconstituted as the Second Polish Republic straight after the war, and they were given a number of French tanks, 120 French tanks, crewed all led by French soldiers, and they became one of the fourth biggest tank power in the world when they got that. So they all go some of their battles a bit later on. The Estonian War of Independence, again, basically breaking away from the Russian Empire. The Turkish War of Independence. This was Ataturk and his
Independence is an interesting way to describe that. But
I didn't look into that one too much, so I just wrote that one down. The warlords of China. So basically, various generals got given FT tanks in China, and then they got used for various civil war and warlord activities.
The Chinese warlord period is tragically little understood, even by me. But the really interesting period if you dig into it. Some Chinese cities were some of the first cities in the world to be electrified. Because the warlord who was running that province said, okay, this is the way we're going. And in a similar spirit, a lot of these Chinese warlords were saying, let's get some of those tanks over here. They seem awesome. Quite hilariously, the Japanese and the Chinese both operated Renault FTs in northern China. And
a Fiat 3000.
Well, okay.
We'll find out later, but yeah, there's a lot of Fiats, just single Fiats running around various countries. All right, the Rif War, I'll get into that later. That was a fun one in North Africa. The Sao Paulo Revolt. So basically, after World War One, and Brazil was involved in World War One on the Allied side, and they took back to Brazil with them a number of tanks, and they were used by the country. The Sao Paulo Revolt of 1924, the Great Syrian Revolt of 1926, the Brazilian Revolution of 1930, Brazilian Constitutional War. I didn't really look into those because there's a lot of wars to get into.
Yep.
The Chinese Civil War, the Spanish Civil War. Again, they were used on both sides of that. I'll just say that now. When the Spanish Civil War kicked off, there were a number of Renault FTs in the army, and half of them basically stayed with went with the Republic, and half of them went with the fascists. So they were, and then the Polish and the French and other countries provided the FTs to the Republican side. The Italians didn't provide any of the Fiat 3000s to the fascists, though. So that was a bit of a
good for them.
Well, they were providing the Caro Armatos and the tankettes and other things.
But it does make you realise that, we look at the Panzer 1 and 2 and be like, that's a totally inadequate vehicle. How could they possibly have done that? And then you for a Renault FT, it's possibly okay. A 20mm autocannon will mess up a Renault FT.
Oh, yeah. Yep. Welcome, Jamie Stokes. I didn't know.
Yeah, Jamie's been on for a bit.
Yep. Oh, there you go. Sorry, I missed you before.
But yes, it has served almost everywhere, and thankfully the French sent one to Australia, which is the basis of our imagery for this episode, because I took a picture of it at the Trelaw Annex. Yes. Should we talk about that one now for a second?
Go for it.
Okay, so Australia has a Renault FT that lives at the Australian War Memorial, and As a child going to the memorial, because, military family, you do that sort of thing a lot. And it's a museum and a memorial, just to be clear for the international audience. My dad, who knows a thing or two about tanks, pointed at it in the distance, said, "Oh, that's a Japanese tank because it looks like a Hargo."
Because the colorations and the camouflage they got on it.
Yeah. And years later, I took a very attractive blonde woman to the memorial. She was visiting from Perth. And I waved it in the distance, said, "Oh, that's a Japanese Hargo. Look how silly it is. Ha, ha, ha." And she went and read the plaque and came back and said, "Actually, that's a French tank. You're wrong." And that was really annoying.
He dumped her on the spot. He said, "I'm not putting up with it."
I wasn't cool enough for this chick, man. There wasn't much going on beyond that. But anyway, so this Renault FT was sitting there with everyone thinking it was a Japanese tank, unless they went and read the wall text. And we actually asked for this episode someone who works at the memorial if they wanted to come on and talk about it, and they came back saying, "We don't know anything about it. The French government gave it to us. We don't know what it did in World War One. We don't know why they gave it to us. It's just been sitting in the collection, and it's such an important tank. We feel the need to just have it sitting in the..."
There is a bit of a write-up on the Australian War Memorial website about it. It was involved. It was in combat. So, But that's about it.
But they know astonishingly little. They are constantly surprised by how little they know about it. Yes, anyway, there it is.
All right, getting back to the conflicts. The Winter War of Finland versus the Soviets in 1939. There were some FTs there on the Finnish side. World War II, we'll get onto that because they were still around, they were still kicking, and they were still doing stuff.
I mean, nothing good.
No.
I mean, but if you're a partisan, this thing is a huge problem. You're lucky if you've got a firearm. And
you got a rifle or a pistol,
or
a shotgun.
And a 37mm, you can't hurt it, and it can hurt you. Yeah.
All right, the Franco-Thai War. So Vichy France versus the Japanese invading... Vichy France invading Thailand. The Arab-Israeli War. Now, I couldn't find much details about that, but they were running around...
Sorry, did you just say the Arab-Israeli War?
1948.
Jesus.
Yeah.
Wow.
48, yep. I know, that's what I'm saying. That's what the Israelis were taking any tanks they could get, and they obviously they were in Syria.
That's in the territory of firing up the gate guard and
1948. So
Wolverines.
Now this is where it gets the fun part, John. Mm-hmm. The Soviet-Afghan War of 1979 to 1988.
Yeah, right.
Yep.
That is Wolverine territory.
They were still kicking around there. They were still they weren't moving a lot.
But that gets to my point that anyone can service these and make them go.
Yeah. They were being used as pillboxes and basically roadblocks. They weren't moving around a lot, but they were involved in the Soviet-Afghan War. And so when the US troops went in 2003 into Afghanistan, they found these things and they brought home 4 of them and said, well, let's at least preserve these things, and they brought home 4 Renault FTs back to America. And
that's some reasonably well versed in history American Army folks to say, "Oh, hang on, this one we really need to."
There you go. All right. So that was the Renault FT. Now we're going to go on to the M1917, the US model.
Okay.
They were used in suppressing race riots in 1919 and 1920.
Oh, good.
Where mobs of white vigilantes tried to hang black prisoners. So they were putting down the white vigilantes.
Okay.
Yep. I'm very surprised they weren't used in the Battle of Blair Mountain in West Virginia in 1921. So for those who haven't read about the Battle of Blair Mountain, that's where the US government bombed and gassed and machine gunned a bunch of coal miners who said they don't want to die of black lung anymore and wanted some better conditions.
Yeah, well, that sort of talk needs suppressing.
It did.
Yeah.
They suppressed it damn hard. Mm-hmm. They did go with the China Marines to China in 1927, 1928. They didn't see any combat.
I'm glad someone else was operating FTs in China in the 20s.
They didn't see any combat. They came back and from China with the US Marines. But they were deployed to put down the bonus army of 1932, as we discussed in the Patton episode.
So the impoverished veterans, desperate to be paid what they were owed for their war service, they got crushed.
They were desperate to be paid early. They were entitled, but they weren't entitled until I think another 5 years or something like that.
Yeah, which is the classic government thing of we'll wait till the veterans have all died off a little more before we actually give them what we promised them.
All right.
Okay, Rob's getting another beer. His head's disappeared. It's very scary.
The headless beer man.
All right, what have we got here? So Rob has of course got us a Korean beer.
It's a journey. All right. Now,
Koreans build tanks.
It was used in Manchukuo, which is
not Korea.
Well, the Japanese bloody had taken Korea, so they're using them there as well. Anyway,
okay.
I was let down by Aldi this time, where the Saint Etienne beer. Two Aldis did not have any Saint Etienne beer, so obviously there is some sort of French beer strike on in Aldi. And I went to another two bottle shops, and there was no Kronenberg or other French beers. But then I saw Cass, a Korean beer, and I said, you know what? We're never, ever going to see this again. Right? This was an opportune moment to just find it and grab it. So remember when we had the K2 episode, and I said, well, how do you get cream beer in Canberra?
There's quite a lot around Heat, and as in HITE, and anyway, go on.
Now I remember our mate Pete talked about drinking plenty of Cass when he was working in Korea. And I said, right, I'm grabbing it and I'm going to give it a go. Yep. So this is us giving it a go. Imported Cass beer. So as I said, it's a journey.
Okay.
Not a destination.
As part of the journey, and having had one sip, it's a pretty okay lager. Slightly stronger hops than I'd normally like in a lager, but it's fine. It's good. It's
cold brewed.
Yeah. Well,
Cass fresh.
Cold brewing just means they took their time, which is good. Yep.
Brewed and canned by Oriental Brewery, Korea.
Ooh, the Oriental Brewery. That sounds authentic.
Republic of Korea. Water, hop malts, hops, starch.
Starch, that covers a lot of sins.
4.5%.
I'm gonna go out on a limb and guess the starch is rice, but
355 mils.
Yep.
Yeah, but anyway,
that's a small one.
It's a slightly smaller than.
It's a Korean-sized one. I say that just because Koreans get really upset when we think they're not as big as Australians. And sorry, guys. I want to be very clear. Korean soldiers are smaller than Australian soldiers because they have conscription, so they get the median height of the Korean population, whereas we have a volunteer army that's selected quite heavily for absolutely terrifying, enormous dudes.
All right.
All
right. Fiat 3000. This is where we get the Italians. They used their Fiats in the pacification of Libya from 1926 to 1933. The Ethiopian coup d'etat of 1928. And then the second Italo-Abyssinian War of 1935, where the Italians had to then face their own Fiat 3000s that they'd given to the Ethiopian government. So basically they'd occupied Ethiopia, had troops there, and had given them the Fiat 3000s. And then when they came back, the Ethiopians tried to basically rebel and say we'd like to be our own kingdom again because Haile Selassie says we are the Lion of Zion. That they then had to when the Italians went back in, they had to fight their own Fiat 3000s.
Right.
Yeah. World War II, they fought in Italian service in the invasion of Albania and Greece when the Italians went in there. I think it was in 1941. And lastly, two companies of Fiat 3000s resisted the Allied invasion of Sicily in 1943, Operation Husky, in the Battle of Gila Island. They were the last Italian fascist tanks in service.
Wow. First and the last?
Yes. So basically, after that time, the Italians surrendered, basically, and came back on the Allies' side when the Nazis were occupying Italy. But they were the last there were no other fascist tanks.
Imagine graduating Italian tanks.
Fighting in and after that.
But imagine graduating Italian tank school and being assigned to the Fiat 3000 company, and you'd be like, "Wow, I'm not very good. I'm the absolute worst."
You could either be in a Carro Amato or a Tankette or a 3941.
Carro Amato.
39.
Yeah.
I mean, it's.
I mean,
your options.
Italian tanks weren't great, but this was a very old tank by that point.
Yeah. Yep. Right.
Purely in the better than nothing category.
The Russian Renault was only used in the Russian Civil War without great effect. More importantly, it provided an innovation spur for the Soviets to produce their own tanks. And I want to say...
The Russians said, we like the look of these, and a great romance was born.
I've got his name. I want to say Alexander Stolinishin, but he was a writer.
Solzhenitsyn's the writer.
Exactly.
But he only died a few years ago.
Yeah, but anyway, the name like that, the guy who did the T-34, was injured fighting against the White Russians and was sent to hospital near where the tanks were being built. He was an engineer and he heard about these things and said, and then he got himself assigned to the factory that was building the Russian Renaults, and from there he then got into tank building and made the T-34 12 years later. Whatever.
Yeah, it's funny because there are a lot of people, and Patton was one of them, who said, this tank thing's going to be big, I want to get into it. But what we never talk about that much is the technologies that people went, oh, this is going to be big, and then they just flopped, like, I don't know, nuclear fusion or, there's but not all promising technologies take off. So the ones who thought the tank was the wave of the future, they were a little lucky, but they were right as well. So, yeah.
All right, actions of note. We'll start off with World War One. With the success of the FT in 1918, bigger offensives were planned for the invasion of Germany in January, February 1919. The first FTs were deployed with the 1st Battalion. Saw its actions in May 1918 at the Forest of Retz. The FTs were widely effective despite their light armour. Basically, where the heavier tanks could crash through trenches and barbed wire and everything else, and would basically stop when they got to a hole that was too big for them, or the artillery could zoom in on them because they were moving so slowly through these obstacles. The FTs could manoeuvre around and between the holes and the shell holes in no man's land, the barbed wire entanglements and everything else, and they could just manoeuvre around and get around to the enemy's position. So they were found to be much more effective in that regard. And their 360-degree turret allowed them to engage targets in any direction, whereas the
whole point of the turret.
The Mark IVs and the French heavies could only fire forwards, essentially. So.
Yep. Fred Banks joined us. G'day, Fred.
And they still allowed the French troops to move in cover from behind them. They were deployed in mass and capable of overrunning entrenched German forces. The turret, overall, the FT was used in 4,000 engagements in World War One, with a total of 746 FTs lost in battle. After the
part of the problem, is that because all the records are in French, English language historians, us included, not that we're historians, we're enthusiasts, very clear on that. They just don't look into the French archives and dig out the stories in the same way. I'm sure for the French language there's more on this, but yeah.
All right. After these successes, Pétain, the leader of the French army, and the overall Allied commander, I think, had the trucks carrying the tanks to the front put on their license plates infantry's best friend, to let the soldiers know that what's going past them is really important and is going to look after them.
That would be super naff. And, generals still do that sort of thing today. But, yeah, anyway, that's cool. Alan's on the line. Good stuff.
All right, the FTs really came into their own during the German Spring Offensive of 1918, when the Eastern Front troops were brought over to the west and deployed before following before the recently arrived American forces could fully apply their capabilities. Floyd Gibbons, a writer at the time, wrote that the American troops saying, "I never saw men charged to their deaths with such fine a spirit." Good on you.
Oh, as the French.
No, as the American troops recently arrived.
Oh, okay. I mean,
their morale was high.
Their morale was high. A big issue is that American generals refused to take any lessons from
the guys who've been slugging out for the last 4 years.
And there's a lot of stuff with fire and maneuver and small unit infantry tactics that is still in use today that the Americans were refusing to listen to. And it cost a lot of young American lives. But hey, those generals are legends.
There was the Second Battle of Marne from 15th to the 18th of July 1918 that saw the last major German offensive. The attack failed when the Allied counterattack, supported by hundreds of tanks, overwhelmed the Germans on the right flank. This marked the start of the Allies' 100-day offensive, ending in the November 11th armistice.
Mm-hmm.
So that was the French use of it. Then we get into the US Army use of the FT.
Mm-hmm.
So the US Army...
And who was the first American to drive an FT? George Patton.
Yeah. So the Americans had ordered their own versions of the FTs to be built, but they could not build them in time to get them back into Europe to be able to fit out the American troops to be able to drive them around. So the French gave them 120 and said, "Here you go, fill your boots, and we'll see you on the battlefield." And as we said, General Serious, I think it was Lieutenant Colonel or Colonel Patton was driving around in these things and leading the charge. So,
and to the point when they got delivered to the Americans, none of the Americans knew how to drive one, so Patton had to personally back them off the train.
Yeah. All right. Although the American Expeditionary Force was new to the French theatre of war, it trained hard for nearly a year in order to prepare for fighting against the Germans. They ordered Pershing, who was General Pershing, who was in charge of the American Expeditionary Force, ordered a lot of training. They got themselves organised into 2 tank battalions and a brigade of tanks.
Sorry.
On the first day of the battle, Patton got himself shot in the arse, bum, bottom.
I mean, he was very lucky to survive. It was a big wound in an area that I think penicillin had just arrived, and that probably saved his life. But he really could have very easily died in that moment.
Basically,
But leading his troops from the top of a tank, waving them forward like Commissar Yarrick with a chainsaw. Yeah.
But that's a Warhammer reference for those, or 40k reference. Basically, 144 tanks. Sorry, not 120. That was the Polish. And they got there, and he was awarded the Distinguished Service Cross for his extraordinary heroism that day. And basically, their attacks overran the Germans in a way and allowed them to carry on the counterattack. One reason for the American forces' success was Pershing's operations order and training and support and logistics. And the other one was that he expected all his leaders to be leading from the front, and so they were. And one of the ones was Brigadier General Douglas MacArthur leading the Rainbow Division, John.
The Rainbow Division, I love the Rainbow Division, particularly in today's climate.
I was about to say,
can I quickly interrupt? Sorry, Brett Parker's asked that he thinks Patton was married to Pershing's daughter. It was Pershing was engaged to Patton's sister.
Yep.
But yeah, there definitely was a...
nepotism.
There is no way Patton's career would have had the trajectory it had if his sister hadn't been engaged to Pershing. But, yeah. Yep. Anyway, the Rainbow Division was called that simply because it was Americans from all across America, and back then the rainbow was still just considered a beautiful symbol of different elements coming together. And it's still a great shoulder patch, the Rainbow Division, because it's a great big rainbow, and I love it.
Can you imagine how many keyboard warriors just...
it's not even the keyboard warriors. I mean, there's nut jobs going into stores all across America complaining if they've got a rainbow flag on the on the counter. It's
signs for the division of light through a prism, or God's sign that that he loves us.
Yeah,
Which one do you want?
it's meant to be. If you read your Bible, which none of these so-called Christians do, yes, the rainbow is a symbol of God love for all of us.
Yeah, saying, I'm no longer going to murder you by drowning the world.
Anywho, back on subject.
All right. They believe the commander's personal control of the situation will help ease the chaos in the battlefield by having their generals all up the front and doing stuff. Polish-Russian War. All right. In April-May 1919, the Polish army was the Blue Army. So you had the White Russians and the Red Russians, and so the Polish army became the Blue Army.
Right. Okay. Speaking of the rainbow.
As I say, they
just need a green and a yellow.
So the Second Polish Republic was formed basically out of the Second World War. First World War, and it's saying, yeah, you can actually be a country again rather than part of the Russian or German empires. They were.
Can we just spare a moment for the sheer resilience and stick-attedness of the Poles to, despite being sandwiched between two horrible empires in the Germans and the Russians, to just keep enduring.
Yep. I mean, they had been at their own power for quite a while.
Well,
then they lost.
If it wasn't for the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, Vienna would have fallen to the Turks. But anyway, let's keep going.
All right. So they were used by. They had 120 FTs, mostly led by the French, and the French had and a number of allied countries had provided support and leadership, advisors to the newly formed Polish nation to fight the Red Russian, the Soviets. At one point in 1920, I want to say, the Russians were on the offensive. The Soviets were on the offensive, and they had pushed through all the Polish defences, and they were on the outskirts of Warsaw. But the Polish general had said, "We're going to have a sweeping counterattack from the sides on this," because they were all worried that the main attack on Warsaw was going to basically overthrow the government and everything else, and it'd all fall apart. The Polish resistance would all fall apart. But luckily enough, the counterattack led by Sikorski's Fifth Army, with a number of FTs, pushed into the Russian flanks, cut them off, and basically won them the war through this main attack on the Battle of Warsaw. It was able to disrupt the Soviet enveloping maneuver, and they were able to advance for 30 kilometres past the Russian troops and cutting them off. A lot of them had to flee to Germany. The Soviet troops, a lot of them fled to Germany because it was easy to get to back then rather than through their own lines. The way the borders were at that stage, it was all a bit of a mess. And from there, they were then allowed to return to the Soviet Union. So, again, the FTs were a major part of the survival of Poland because they were able to win this Battle of Warsaw that they were about to be losing because they had collapsed everywhere else. Then we get into the Rif War. All right. Spain and France had taken Morocco as part of a joint protectorate in 1884. The Rif tribes that were in the area of the mountains of Morocco were never under the control of the Sultan/King of Morocco. So when Spain never really had control of the region and was always fighting colonial wars from 1909 to 1926. When they were given the Renault FTs, they started using them more to suppress the local tribes and try and impose their leadership. And in 1925, the Spanish carried out the first amphibious landings with tanks with the FT.
Yeah, the Irish always claim to have conducted the first armoured amphibious landing, but that was armoured cars. So, okay, that's still good.
And they were supported by French naval and air power. So again, a combination of naval, air, and tank landings. So basically, one of those first events of tanks happening and as the amphibious landings. This operation eventually led to the capture of the RIF leadership by France and Spain, manoeuvring their forces and the local tribes surrendering. Right. World War II. France deployed 504 Renault FTs in the Battle of France, plus others dug in on the Maginot Line. They were quite a sizable force of the French tank force at the time. France also had Air Force units using them for airfield defence. They also had 63 in French Syria and 244 in North Africa. These colony tanks were then used by Vichy France and even fought against US forces landing in Morocco for Operation Torch. The Nazis, on the other hand, took over 1,700 of the Renault FTs for themselves, calling them the Panzer Kampfwagen 17R730CF. I've got no idea what all those numbers have been.
Well, 17R's, 1917 Renault, which is nice of them to give the nod there.
Yeah.
On the other hand, we will talk about Louis Renault's relationship with the Nazis, which to do with that. Anywho.
All right. Operators. World War I, France. US, UK, only the command vehicles. Italy, supposedly the Germans captured some and used them. After the war, Kingdom of Afghanistan, Belgium, Brazil, China, various warlords, independent state of Croatia, so that was after the Kingdom of Yugoslavia was broken up.
Wasn't the period when the Nazis made an independent Croatia?
That's what I'm thinking.
Yep.
Czechoslovakia, Estonia, Finland, Vichy France, because they still had their own tanks, even though Nazis. Iran, some tanks were received from France in 1924. Japan, they got 13. Italy had 7 FTs in 1919. Lithuania, Manchukuo, which were ex-Chinese tanks from 1931, with some Japanese or French tanks later supplied. Netherlands, 1 for trials. Commonwealth of the Philippines, 1 ex-American tank. Poland, 120 plus, as discussed. Kingdom of Romania, 74.
Romania. Yeah.
The White Russians got a number. The Soviets took theirs and built them into, captured White Russians and built them into the Russian Renaults. Spain, they got 18 in 1919. They had another 48 from deliveries from France and Poland. And then they got more and another 48 delivered from France and Poland to the Spanish Republican forces. Sweden got 1 for trials. Switzerland got 2, and then another 3 in 1939 for training. Turkey got 13. UK got the 24 on loan for command and control and reconnaissance, and they were returned after the war. US got 124 on loan and given back. Kingdom of Yugoslavia got 30. Israel, we're not sure how many they got, but obviously they've...
I'm not sure they got them as much as got them from somewhere.
Took them from Syria. Plus any successor states to those empires and all their colonies as the world changed in the interwar period through to World War II, because basically there was a lot of changes in countries and so forth.
Now, we got it in the slideshow. Magna, one of our listeners, sent it to us, a picture he'd taken, I think, in 2005, of a lonely Renault FT sitting up looking at in Norway, way up in the north of Norway in a place called Van, which I'd never heard of before. No offence to anyone who's from there. And it's still overlooking the Barents Sea, and it was the occupying Germans had moved it up there to control the locals, and it's still sitting there. I looked it up there. There's people on Reddit every few years go, "Hey, there's this really old tank up here." And I mean, it's rusting away, and the front idler wheels have rotted away, but there it lurks. Yeah.
All right. World War II, France, Germany, and various Axis puppet states, and Vichy France used the Renault FT. The M1917 was used by the USA, and they then sold a number of them to Canada as training vehicles in 1939. The Fiat 3000 used by Italy, and the following countries bought 1 or 5, or between 1 and 5 for testing purposes. Argentina, the Soviets, Ethiopia, Albania, Hungary, Spain, Latvia got 6, Denmark and Japan. So all of them bought, should we try these guys out? Yeah, nah, maybe. The Russian Renault, just by the Soviets, Move on to the variants in the new world.
Oh, the variants, Rob, the variants.
In the new world of tank building, there were a lot of variants tried. So you got the Shah Canon, which is the FT with the 37mm short barrel gun. The Shah Mitrailleuse, an FT with the 8mm Hotchkiss M19 1914 machine gun. The FT-75, an FT with a short barrel 75mm gun. 40 of those were produced, so basically it was an artillery piece, self-propelled gun.
Yeah, I'm just trying to contemplate a 75 in that turret, but I imagine that's why they didn't build too many.
Short barrel. The Shah Signal, or the TSF, a command tank with a radio. TSF stands for Telegraph Sans Fil. So it's a wireless.
Now, this was, again, because this is at the birth of tanks. They hadn't figured out yet that you do not want your communication and command tank to look any different from all the other tanks. And this one does, and I imagine it got targeted quite dramatically.
So it had a great big boxy turret rather than the round turret with a gun, and it had no gun. So it did have a 3-man crew. They had produced 100 of those. The Fiat Model 31, which was upgraded the Italian tanks with from the 6.5 to the 7.5 Rival machine gun. 1,000 of those. Hang on, there must have been 100 of those converted.
Yeah, 1,000 is a lot.
Yeah. Maybe they were the French ones. Maybe I've got it all wrong. The FT FT Disarmed, which is where they had the 37mm guns removed to be installed on more modern tanks. They were then repurposed for other activities, such as...
Sorry, just quickly, Tasman's chimed in that the self-propelled gun version didn't have a turret.
Oh, there you go.
So that makes a lot more sense.
Yeah. The disarmed versions, they were made into bridge carriers, so they can carry a light bridge.
An engineering vehicle version of this little thing is they're all still figuring it out, but it's funny.
And some were rearmed with a FM 2429 light machine gun. The Polish built their own versions of it, but they were called the Polish CWS. They were for training purposes only. They weren't the armor on them was not hardened steel. It was just soft steel. So they were only for training purposes. They built 27 of those. They also built a gas tank, which had twin gas cylinders to create smoke screens or carry out chemical attacks. Only one of those was built. There was a plan to convert France's many FTs in 1939 to tank destroyers by putting a 47mm APX anti-tank gun in
Sorry, that's the funniest idea ever. Yeah,
instead of the turret.
Of all the bad ideas the French were having in that period, that's not the worst, but it's right up there.
It didn't leave the drawing board.
Yeah.
And
the thing can only move 8 kilometres an hour. How is it going to get to where the Panzer 1s and 2s are streaming through? And let's not forget the PZ-38Ts, which were the point of the spear.
Yeah. And the FT Co, which is the 13 tanks bought by Japan in 1919, modified and armed with either the 37mm French gun or machine guns. So they did a bit of mucking around with them themselves to be able to call them their own 37 FT Co's. All right. Legacy of the FT. This is the important part, boys and girls. Make sure you listen carefully. It does make an appearance in Girls und Panzer.
Aha! Most important thing.
Exactly.
And my friend Taylor's tattoo, which is in the slideshow. But yeah.
Operated by the Maginot School and the BC Freedom Academy. It's the oldest tank taking part in Girls und Panzer, just pipping the Mark IV. There is even if you look on the internet, there is even what appears to be a replica FT-17 turning up at Girls und Panzer conventions in Japan. So they make a decent effort of getting it out there, because it's if it's not a real FT, it's a bloody good looking replica.
That's kind of the point with the FT, is it's just small enough to do stuff with.
They just put it in the back of the truck, and so they have Japanese lasses dressing up as, and boys dressing up as the characters from Girls und Panzer and sitting in the back of the
There's
Renault
not
FT.
a lot of work for the boys in the Girls und Panzer fandom, but
I think they just dress up as girls. That's the point. Because if you want to be part of it, Got to be part of it.
Yeah.
All right. We've talked about the operational mobility. One of the fun ones, John, is there are more running original Renault FTs than there are Tiger ones. Think of that.
There are more running FTs than there are British battleships. Because the British they built over 100 battleships and they kept none. Except for Royal Oak, which is at the bottom of Scapa Flow. But yeah.
Is that so much keeping it, or?
Well, they didn't have a choice about that one. Anyway, but battleships are not within the scope of this podcast. But this is going to turn into a long podcast because we've still got 40 minutes of Peter Samsonov. Okay. We'll just keep going.
Well, I'm almost there. All right. The FT-17 was the longest serving tank from 1917 to 1988 in the Afghanistan Soviet War. 71 years. However, when you think about it, there are probably T-54-55s that may have been in service from 1950 that are still running around today, giving it the new edge of longevity around 74 years. But as they were built from the 1940s through to 1983...
You need to know what the mark was.
You got to finding an original... T-54, 55 in running order and on operations may be a bit harder to do. So, depending on if you can figure out what T-54, 55s are actually running around out there and doing their job, the FT's probably still got the edge on oldest operational tank or longest serving operational tank.
It probably is today, but I would put my money on the T-55 because it is so simple, so reliable, and still so effective.
Yeah, but how many of those original ones are running around us? Who knows? All right, you want to talk more about Louis Renault? Yeah,
let's talk about Louis Renault, and then we'll go to the break. So the things to know about Louis Renault, and to be honest, I've driven Renault cars, but I knew nothing of the man before we decided to do this episode. He is an absolute titan of the automotive industry. One of, by no means limited to, his innovations was that everyone was using bicycle chains to run the drive from the engine to the wheels in cars until Louis Renault came along and thought, what about if we fix a drive shaft? And that also meant inventing, transmissions and lots of things. So he might not quite be Henry Ford in terms of the innovations he brought to the automotive industry, but he's pretty close, and I'm going to say some mean things about him in a bit, but his genius, his intelligence, his problem-solving ability, and his influence on the modern world and French industry is titanic. But guess what, Rob? As a first-generation founder of an automotive business, what did you think he thought of Jews and unions?
Well, I think if he had anything to do with Henry Ford, then maybe he.
Well, I'm not sure you ever met Henry Ford.
Was he a bit of not a fan?
He was not a fan of unions, and also did not like the Jews. The workers called him the ogre of Billancourt, and did not like him at all. A bit like William Morris, who we talked about in the Cromwell episode. A lot like William Morris, who we talked about in the Cromwell episode. Anyway, so Louis Renault was a hero of France for building the FT in World War I, and then when the fall of France came about in 1940, Louis decided, for reasons we'll get into, he built 33,000 vehicles for the Nazis.
He was a car builder.
He built 33,000. The next biggest French manufacturer for the Germans.
Did Hitler have a dedication to him in Mein Kampf?
No. Only Henry Ford had that. Yes, but okay. So the next biggest French manufacturer providing vehicles to the Germans in World War II, provided 5,000. Just to give sense of scale for the 33,000. And here's the important thing to note: in 1942, he had a massive stroke, and he was kind of Hector Salamanca from that point on, in that he couldn't write and he couldn't speak, but somehow he was still making his wishes known. I don't know if it was ringing a little bell, but anyway, come 1944 and the liberation of France, the French, who were back in control, He surrendered to them on condition that there was something like he not be tried for anything that wasn't proven or something like that. Anyway, he didn't quite die in prison, but he was transferred to a medical facility, having fallen into extremely bad health and died within weeks later. His family have always claimed that he was beaten and tortured in prison.
Family or mistress?
No, his wife and things.
Okay.
Well, here's the thing, because the French government took away the entire Renault industrial empire and nationalised it. And paid no compensation to Louis or his family, and this is still the subject of litigation to this day. The French, all the records of his time in prison were lost. Or
It was a hectic time.
don't exist. It was a hectic time. They refused to conduct an autopsy after he died. So his body was exhumed in the 50s, and they were found to be cracked vertebrae consistent with
Massive beatings.
Yeah, so it was a very grim end. Now, to be fair to him, his argument to his dying day was that if he hadn't built vehicles for the Germans were going to move all his industrial plant and all his workers to labour camps in Germany. And that's a kind of interesting thing that in 1940 he knew that it was a death sentence to be in a German labour camp, because a lot of people, a lot of them still to this day, will argue that, no one knew that what the Nazis were doing. It appears Louis Renault did know what they were doing, and it used that as his justification for helping the Nazis. Maybe he did save the lives of his workers. There's a claim that in his will he actually left his industrial empire to the workers, and there were 40,000 of them. And I've seen it written down. It was in Time magazine in the 1950s. It doesn't seem to me to be consistent with the fact that his family still claim to be owed 95% of the Renault empire. There's a lot of things I have no interest in digging into there.
But just know that the FTs were involved as part of the liberation of Paris. By being used by the Nazis, and then when they were taken over by the partisans as they were fighting the Nazis in Paris.
I don't think the partisans cared too much about. Well, they definitely cared about Henry because they treated him very poorly when they got hold of him. But at that moment, Louis, they were very happy to use his vehicle when they needed them. Cool. Okay.
All right. I think we'll pause there and show our little chat with Peter Samsonov this morning about the Achtung Tiger.
Yes.
I think our video and sound issues were less than his chat with the chieftain the other day.
Yeah, no, that went smoothly. I mean, my video looks crap for reasons I don't understand, but the sound is all good. So we are going to put you over to that now using our magical new technology.
Let's hope it works.
So we are joined for the second time by Peter Samsonov, the tank archive himself. And Peter's here to talk us about his new book, which is sure to get tank fans excited all around the world, Achtung Tiger. Peter, welcome back to the show. There it is. Look at that.
There it is. Beautiful picture of a tiger, not really in the state that it's shown on most book covers, where it's in a sort of, top of the food chain, dominating the battlefield. I think this gives you a little bit of a hint as to what's going to be inside this book.
Yep.
So
now Go, Rob.
Achtung Tiger. Usually we'd say Achtung Panzer. So who would be saying Achtung Tiger?
Presumably the Germans, saying, here comes their tiger. It's going to sweep away the enemy. Everything's going to go great for us. And spoilers, it didn't. I think your viewers are probably going to be aware of the outcome of that war already. But yes, this book is, as the name implies, or as the subtitle implies, how the Allies executed Germany's heavy tank. Covers the Tiger tank from the Allied perspective, which means the Tigers appearing in this book are ones that have been knocked out or captured, or otherwise obtained through field expedient means by British, American, or Soviet forces, rather than the majority of literature that exists out there, which focuses exclusively on the German perspective.
Yeah. Now, what's the subtitle of the book, Peter? Can you read that out for us?
How the Allies defeated Germany's heavy tank.
So it's not your run-of-the-mill Tiger fanboy publication then.
Quite the opposite. This is they talk about it in the intro a little bit. So I have a foreword by Marcus Pullman and a preface by Ralph Ratz, and they kind of talk about why the Tiger is such a big, almost household name, right? If you draw it, like ask some person who maybe doesn't really know anything about tanks to draw a tank, they're going to draw you a Tiger tank. Why is that? And they do discuss that, the Tiger is a product of decades. The image of the Tiger in popular culture is a product of decades. Whereas a tank like maybe, I don't know, the T-50 or something, or the T-70 or the Stuart, right? They're not very famous tanks. They would have fought in the war for a couple of years. Someone would have written down a couple of technical reports. 1945 rolls around and everyone forgets about them as soon as they possibly can. The Tiger is one of those tanks that kind of kept living a life of its own after that, which is not necessarily a good thing because of all this sort of almost cult around it. And there's a video I actually did recently about this. So I did an AMA on Reddit to Ask Historians, where by far the most popular question that came up was, why is a Tiger so popular? And I did a video just talking about that in my YouTube channel, Tank Archives, where, well, the conclusion is that there's all this stuff that's been building up around it for decades after the war. Not the least of all is the concept of the Tiger race. And Ralph Ratz and Marcus Pullman do touch that a little bit, where Germany, the Tiger comes in at a time of crisis for Germany. So, 1939, you have the campaign in Poland. They swoop in, all these huge arrows on the map, massive territories taken in a matter of weeks. France, same thing. One of the great European powers is just overrun in a month and a half. Eastern Front, 1941, you have huge encirclements, rapid advances all the way through, almost to Moscow, within a couple dozen kilometers of Moscow. And then 1942 hits, and you don't really get that. You get some stuff in the south, like next to Stalingrad, but that peters out pretty quickly. Moscow hasn't fallen. Leningrad hasn't fallen, even though it's besieged. Something's happening in North Africa, but that's like some,
sideline.
Yeah, it's kind of a storm in a teacup. It's Rommel's playing with some Italians or something. Who cares?
As the Russians say. So how many army groups were involved in that? Eh?
Yeah. And so the question is, okay, well, what do we do? Our propaganda, and I'm using the word propaganda in its period kind of term. Our propaganda needs something, right? It needs heroes. Our generals used to be the heroes, but you can't really say, look how great they're doing. They've moved, let's look at a map, 20 kilometers over the past, move your liquid cabinet 20 feet closer to Berlin kind of situation. So you need a new generation of heroes. And these are the guys doing tactical successes. And these are your tank commanders, your tank crewmen, and the Tiger appears right in this situation, and it's the perfect storm. It's the heaviest tank on the battlefield. It's the heaviest armored. I mean, the Churchill has slightly more frontal armor, but it doesn't really matter. Overall, it's the heaviest armored. It's got the biggest gun, and so it is really at that time quite a powerful opponent. And so you get this aura of invincibility around it, or, oh my God, it's a Tiger, it's going to get us all. The Germans are stoking the fire. The rumors of the campfires are stoking the fire. I mean, Throughout 1943, the tiger is relatively unknown, and so the unknown always breeds this kind of, you fill in the gaps, and you fill in the gaps with your imagination, and obviously your imagination is going to, it's not going to say it's a tiger just like any other tank. We can shoot at it until it blows up. So that long tangent, but the point of my book, the specific way that I wrote this book, if you go to the back, well, let's start with the military history group motto: footnotes or bust. This book, it's like I've opened to a random page, and you see that half of the page is footnotes. There's, I think, 20 something, 40 something pages of bibliography. If you look at there, that's not including the appendices. So the idea here was, the only way to get rid of all of this tiger mythology that's been developed over the past couple of decades is to go back to period sources. These would be the people who wrote the documents that this book is based on. They were like the staff officers, the engineers. They weren't really a part of that front line in the trenches around the campfire kind of mythology where every tank was a tiger, every gun was an 88. They knew perfectly well how many 88s the enemy had, they knew perfectly well how many tigers the enemy had. And so they made conclusions based on the intelligence they could see. And sometimes those conclusions were correct, but sometimes they were not. There's a diagram of the tigers. So for one, I do include the official characteristics in the book. So wherever possible or wherever it's interesting, I say, here's what the Soviets found, here's what the British found, here's what the Germans actually established. Sometimes all these line up, sometimes they don't. But as you can see in the factory figures, Bomb-proof, Zex, and Henschel had vastly different data. Not vastly, but dump speed is different for the Tiger. The combat weight is different. Even the size is different in some places. So it's not like on right now we have the internet. You can go in a second and look something up. Sometimes, if you measure one tiger and it's 5 centimeters, a couple of inches, whatever, longer than another one. That can happen. And if you have official factory documentation and you can get data from that, you'll get one number. If you go out in the battlefield and measure another tiger, that's another number. There's a tiger armor diagram here. And again, nothing really stunning or sensational. Just some of this data is included just for a comparison. And on the off chance this is somebody's first tiger book, if it is, then interesting choice. Not to discourage people from buying it, of course, but I wouldn't expect that to be the first book on the tiger, but just in case the data is there. So when I was composing that diagram, I was actually using the British report on Tiger 131. I wasn't using German data. And I drew a nice little picture of a tiger, and I was looking at it and thinking, this is wrong. This doesn't look like a tiger. Why doesn't it look like a tiger? And so then I realized that when I compared it with just kind of drawings on the internet, is that the slope of the rear armor was wrong. It was 25 degrees. In the British data, it was supposed to be 9 degrees. And this is the tank they have in their possession. They can come with a protractor and check. So these are the kind of things that sometimes, even if you have a tank, even if you measured it, climbed all over it, recorded everything, your data is still wrong. That's part of the reason why about half of the book, let me see where it splits there, more or less half of the book is dedicated to the Soviet experience, and half of the book is dedicated to, I call it the Anglo-American experience, lumping the two together, because a lot of the time, these reports were just in one heap. Actually, for the majority of this comes from the Canadian archives. Where the Canadian headquarters in London, they were getting British documents, they were getting American documents. It all went into a stack, and where it's relevant, the source of the document is written, which kind of lets you see a slight difference in the way that the British and the Americans perceive the tiger. There is a comparison as well of penetration data, where the British and the Americans, they're using the same weapons pretty much. They're using, the same 75mm guns, or at the very least, guns with the same ballistics. They're using uh, 6-pounder is 57 millimeters. They're using this. Both of them are using scout cars and light tanks with 37 millimeter guns. So really, all the same weapons. They get different data. Sometimes the data is only slightly different. Sometimes the data is very different. So you kind of hear a lot. Oh, anything the Soviets wrote is propaganda. It's garbage. To appease Stalin. Never believe anything the Soviet wrote. But Soviet penetration data, in a number of cases, agrees to something like a couple of yards with what the British discovered. So that's why this is a very good, I think, comparison to have. I don't think anything has happened. Anything has been done on this scale to compare the two experiences. Newsom's Tiger and Tank and Allied Intelligence, on the back cover, it talks about, we discussed the Soviet experience. And I'm like, all right, it's going to be awesome. Let's see what he found out, because the previous volumes had some really great stuff. A lot of it does overlap with what I have in this book. A lot of it doesn't. And the Soviet experience was 2 paragraphs. That's it. And it essentially boiled down to a very surface level description of the Tiger tanks displayed in Gorky Park.
Even though they were the ones facing most of the Tigers.
Yes, which of course I do cover in great detail in here. So if you read that book and you were disappointed by lack of the Soviet side, do buy Achtung Tiger. If you never read that book, still buy Achtung Tiger. It's going to be a fresh new look at the Tiger tank for sure.
Yeah, it's fantastic that you've done that. I'm a little curious. There's 2 things I'd like to get your thoughts on. Firstly, is armor penetration has always struck me as being something that's a lot more random than tables of 900 millimeters of penetration would actually have you believe, partly because the metal isn't as homogeneous and standard as everyone would like it to be, and partly because the incoming rounds are not performing in the same way all the time either. And let's go with that. To what extent are all of these numbers a little bit best guess?
Well, my educational background is not in history. It is in engineering, and so this, in many ways, this is an engineer's book. It has your tables, it has your numbers. It's a table of Tiger armor metallurgy, and we compare the actual standards of what the Germans wanted their armor to be like with what their armor was actually like, and a lot of the time they miss their own standard completely. But before talking about, this gun has 100 millimeters penetration, this gun has 200, so it's better. You need to figure out what it is what these numbers mean. And this has been discussion on the internet for probably about 10 years now, maybe a bit more. I think it was 2013 or 2014 when Wargaming published a penetration diagram in Soviet archives, where a lot of the data was very different from what people were used to. And that started a little uproar. And so the question...
At least they weren't giving away any state secrets that time.
Well, the states that made these secrets no longer exist. So I think you're good to publish that at that point. And then a lot of people were very upset because a lot of people study history in order to confirm that everything they've ever believed has always been true, and they don't need to change their opinion. It turns out that's not necessarily the case all the time. But then the question is, what do these numbers mean? And thankfully, there are more detailed penetration tests. I'm going to get a little bit off topic, talking about the Panther. When testing various Soviet guns against the Panther, there was an interesting note where I forget the range or even the gun, but essentially the description of the damage is a round ricocheted off the front plate, created a breach something like 3 feet wide. All this junk went inside the tank. Obviously, any tanks would write off anybody who was inside the tank would be dead. The round, bounced off, ricocheted somewhere. This is recorded as no penetration. Because the Soviets' criteria for penetration is 50% of the shell must be inside the tank, behind the armor. If it flew up into the stratosphere, it is not, strictly speaking, behind the armor. The fact that the armor itself is not behind the armor is irrelevant. The engineers have a standard that they follow, and according to the standard, this is no penetration.
Is that why the Soviets never adopted HESH? Because it technically never penetrates? Sorry, just a crazy thought there.
No, there is a test. This is post-war already, but there is a test of some captured HESH shells, and they perform pretty much exactly the same as 125 millimeter HE in terms of armor penetration. So I imagine there was very little impetus to copy them.
Sure. I was talking more about weaponry that's intended to create spalling versus direct entry. But just the other thing that really struck me was you talked about every tank a Tiger. Do you think that's part of the mythos? I mean, I know we've come across cases where the Allies were claiming they'd destroyed a Tiger, most famously with that Greyhound. And then it turns out that it was actually a Stug when someone goes out and checks what was destroyed. But by that point, it's entered the mythos. And I've literally been told at tank museums about the Greyhound destroying the Tiger. So it's pernicious and pervasive. But do you think it's just, when people say Tiger, they really just mean German tank, which on the Western Front was alarming because they were so rare but controllable?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that is a part of it. I mean, I cover it a little bit, the idea that every tank is a Tiger, but there's actually so in the American section in the back, I do talk about this kind of difference between how commonly American soldiers recorded a Tiger and how commonly it was actually encountered. Tigers in Normandy were encountered by American forces 3 times. So yeah, it's not a very common tank. Generally, there's a clip I think on YouTube, which is a British maybe tank identification training video. And we're used to identifying tanks by walking up to them in a museum and going, that's a Tiger. You could see that the wheels match.
Count the road wheels, look at the exhaust. Yep.
Late 1943 production, and the Kupol is early 1944 production. And how could they make such an amateur mistake? I can't believe I'm going to complain to the director. This is trash. How could they show this? I paid money to see this, And soldiers at the time, as this video shows, you'd see a flash of something vaguely tank-shaped somewhere over there. And if you were talking with the lads about a Tiger tank earlier today, like maybe somebody's tank did get knocked out by a Tiger, and the crew gets back to base, and you go, "Wow, a Tiger knocked us out." And then each person they tell goes and tells 5 other people, "Hey, as you hear, Bob's crew got knocked out by a Tiger," and this kind of thing spreads, because the Tiger, as Pullman talks in the introduction, it's the name of a beast, right? If if your tank got knocked out by Sunder, God, what was it? Kraftfahrzeug, 181, it's like yawn, snore, whatever. I can't believe a bunch of numbers destroyed my tank. I'm just gonna get the next one right. But it's a Tiger, right? It's got that marketing behind it.
So, and the Russians only ever call it what do you say, the P6?
T6, yeah.
T6,
kind of
that's right.
very similar sort of. It's actually really interesting because on one side, the Tiger comes in August 1942. Soviet intelligence misses it completely because you have 4 tanks that are fielded. They all break down. 3 of them can be evacuated. 1 of them can't. And it sits in no man's land for months because the Germans don't want to blow up their fancy new expensive tank. And the Soviets don't care. It's some kind of box-shaped tank over there. The Germans have lots of box-shaped tanks. Who cares? It didn't accomplish anything. It didn't achieve anything. There's nothing to draw attention to it. Plus, the Germans keep shooting artillery around it. Let's not go there. We don't really need to. So the Tigers are only discovered in January of 1943. Sorry. And they're taken for trials, and they get to Kubinka somewhere around April, and they're tested by late April. And there's this sort of spike in, oh, we need to develop new weapons, we need to develop new tactics to deal with this new tank. In mere weeks, you get Kursk, which means Panthers, which means Ferdinands, which means PaK 43s, a whole new slew of weapons. And so a lot of the weapons, the new Soviet weapons that come in late 43 and early 44, people point and say, oh, it came after the Tiger, and therefore they were meant to fight the Tiger. No, they were meant to fight. They were meant to fight the Ferdinand. The IS-4, which was put, or Object 701, eventually accepted into service as the IS-4, that was put into development in December of 43. That's designed as an anti-Ferdinand vehicle. It has nothing to do with the Tiger.
And they were. Sorry, they were also looking beyond the Tiger as well, weren't they? Into, what's the next generation of German tanks going to be when they were designing those late war Soviets.
Yeah, right. Because on the Soviet side, if you don't have that knowledge of what the Germans are working on, it's frightening, right? You have Panzer IVs with, I don't know, 50 millimeters of armor, right? That armor doubles in January of 43 to 100 millimeters of front armor. Then that armor doubles again almost. You see Ferdinands with 180 millimeters of front armor by middle of the year. And what's going to happen next? Obviously, with hindsight, we know that the next German tank, the big one, was the King Tiger that came out a year later in August of 44. But the Soviets didn't know that. They had no way of knowing it. And so they're saying, oh, we can't just fight the Tiger. We can't just fight the Panther. We need to fight the next thing. And so the developers, the arms designers, they've forgotten all about the Tiger. The Tiger is old news. They're working on these future threats. But people on the front line, they still remember that there's such a thing as a Tiger, and it's still there, and they still need to fight it. And so in 1944, it shifts from proving grounds trials and kind of these official trials to frontline trials, where you capture a Tiger, well, no one else wants it. Let's shoot it up, see what happens. And that's how you see the impact of the 122 millimeter guns. There is a little bit in official trials, but that gun shot last, and one of the shots, it goes through a previously existing hole, goes all the way through the tank, and then punches through the back. And you kind of say, well, the T-20 or the A-19 at that point could penetrate the back of a Tiger, but that's not really what we wanted to know. And there's a lot of data from these field proving grounds, field trials in 1944. They also test the SU-152's gun, which in actual trials did not score a single hit that was counted. And the 100 millimeter gun, the D10C, is tested as well, because by the time that gun was developed, the Tiger was old news. It was never tested against the Tiger tank officially. It was tested on Panthers. So these trials give us, and then there's some absolutely wild stuff like shooting anti-tank rifles and 45 millimeter anti-tank guns at the tracks, which nobody probably would do in official trial of it proving grounds, but some gunners had some spare shells, so here we go. We get.
Was that effective?
The 45 millimeter gun, yes. Anti-tank rifle, no. They're saying that you can break a Tiger's track with a 14.5 millimeter rifle. You need to score 2 or 3 hits on the same track length. A shooting range, you can. In real life,
if it's stationary,
maybe not. So
yeah.
The conclusion was that let's stick with the real guns for fighting Tigers. But there's actually a document that I have in my collection, I can't remember if it's in the book or not, where a Soviet commander is asking, where are the Tigers? I was promised Tigers. Where are they? Our entire army hasn't found any in 3 months of fighting. Where'd they go? And obviously the answer is there were never that many Tigers to begin with. Even on the Eastern Front, they were relatively rare occurrences. But there is that kind of mythos that developed around them as well. And if you look at post-war movie tanks, which is kind of really how you can tell what settled down in popular culture and the collective consciousness as the German tank, it's Tigers.
Kelly's Heroes, I think, is
Yeah, it's not Panthers. You would think it'll be easier to make a movie Panther because it's got the sloped frontal armor and everything. But no, these are Tiger tanks, made of plywood over top of IS-2s. So
Mm.
it also, even though the army was not so concerned about Tigers, or concerned about bigger threats, your average guy on the front lines, he still remembers what a Tiger is. So there is that very different way that the Tiger is perceived by the brass and the rank and file.
Yeah. Now, without wanting to give away the ending of your book, Peter, how did the Allies beat the Tiger?
By shooting it with guns a lot.
Okay.
One of the
Tried and true.
maybe not surprising conclusions is that the Tiger was never invulnerable. One of those kind of popular culture myths is that, oh, the Tiger could just do whatever it wants in the battlefield. And there's the one example of a Tiger that withstood 150 hits on the battlefield and returned to its lines. And wow, it's truly a pinnacle of German engineering. If you kind of read, not only between
as long as it didn't roll over some barbed wire, get that caught up in tracks and get caught and get stuck and then have to be abandoned.
Yeah, so that Tiger tank that returned to its from that mission, most of those hits were not cannon shells; they were anti-tank rifle hits, and it suffered tremendous amounts of damage. Torsion bars, buckling, etc. So this was a mission kill. This tank had to go into repairs for a very long time. So you can kind of see that even this sort of propaganda example of the Tiger's invincibility was not, well, it wasn't invincible. It suffered quite a lot of damage in this mission. And that's what both the Soviets and the British found out, and the Americans found out, is that the Tiger can be beaten. It can be beaten not just by future weapons, but by weapons we already have. So there's instructions that are included in the back, Appendix 2 and 3. They're Soviet instructions to anti-tank gunners. And there's basically two versions of the same thing. One is a very dry, technical, here's some numbers, here's some tables kind of approach. And one that's aimed at officers, commanders, people who walk around with big folders full of papers and clipboards all the time. And then there's a very colloquial kind of, not maybe necessarily simpler, but more memorable description of how to defeat a Tiger, and that's what's targeted towards the NCOs, the sergeants, the privates, where they're not going to have a bunch of tables of data with them. They're going to read this pamphlet, this flyer, and you need them to remember how to fight a Tiger. And if you make it memorable and make it interesting and make it fun, it's kind of like a Tiger fibble, right? Is you have all the drawings of naked ladies that help the Germans remember how to use their tank properly.
Well, it helps them to look at the page in the first place, doesn't it?
Right. Yeah, so it's kind of two different approaches to the same thing, but these instructions say, hey, the Tiger, it's not invulnerable. Like, it's a tough target, but here's how it fights, and here's how you can fight it. Because the Tiger is a cog in a machine. It's not, you watch Fury or Saving Private Ryan or whatever, and there's the Tiger, and it's the one Tiger, and it's driving around, and it's invincible, right? You need some clever trick or great sacrifice or something like that to, or the gun from Kelly's Heroes that shoots paintballs. You need to something unconventional, something out of the ordinary to defeat it. In reality, not so much. The Tiger, and both the British and the Soviets noted this, always fights in a group, and it's a big group. A Tiger is accompanied by medium tanks. A Tiger is accompanied by a screen of infantry. A Tiger is accompanied by artillery. It's accompanied by assault guns that like to park themselves on hills surrounding the battlefield and protect the Tiger. And so if you actually don't even attack the Tiger, like fine, you only have your relatively light weapons, 45mm guns or 2-pounders, you can attack its supporting elements. And if the Tiger is unsupported, it will retreat. The Tigers do not like a fair fight. And this is something that the British even noted in Italy. Tigers that come under fire will retreat even if the damage that could be dealt to them is superficial. Presumably by that point, Tiger crews were very aware of the fact that if their tank broke down, it could not be easily recovered. but there's actually a memo in the book saying that, hey, it's a German memo translated by the British, saying how the Tiger cannot ignore the laws of tank combat. First rule of the Tiger is, first of all, don't use a Tiger if you can avoid it. If you can use a Stug or even a platoon of infantry, just do that. Tiger is very expensive. It costs the German Reich 300,000 man-hours. It actually doesn't. The Tiger has never cost more than 180,000 man-hours, but that could just be an exaggeration for effect, or it could be, just rounding up, and someone else rounded up, and someone else rounded up, etc. But the whole point is, this is a very big tank. It's a very expensive tank. Use it responsibly. You can't just drive up on a hill and stick your head out, as they put in the memo, to take a look. There's a list of a bunch of weapons that the British have, the Soviets have, the Americans have, that can destroy Tiger. This includes the IS-2, obviously. A lot of the memo is about the IS-2. But a lot of it has stuff like 57mm guns. So ZIS-2s, 6-pounders, could destroy Tiger even from the front. And these are guns from like 1941, 1942. Sherman and T-34 could destroy Tiger from the side and at fairly close range, but they could still do it. Greyhound, maybe. There's some very optimistic figures where if you hit, actually a model of a Tiger here. So this part of the armor is 82 millimeters. And underneath that kind of skirt there, behind the wheels, that armor is only 62 millimeters. So if you shoot from a 37mm gun into there, from 150 yards,
and you're at the bottom of the hill shooting up, and it's staying still. Yeah.
Well, I mean, this part's actually like just sheet metal. It's a mud part, but yeah, you need this. This is a fairly tiny space in between there, and it did test that if you hit the wheel, the shell doesn't go through the main armor anymore. So it's a very difficult shot. It has to be done at a very close range. It's kind of one of those never say never, but also probably not situations. And that's kind of how the Tiger was defeated. Except sometimes, as one of the reports that I used in the book is called, Tiger killed himself. Let me see if I find it. But the conclusion is, it's an analysis of Tiger tanks in Italy. And they look at the absolutely tremendous amount of Tiger tanks that were just abandoned on the side of the road. And yeah, Italy was a really bad time for Tiger tanks because the ranges at which tanks fought were fairly short. The Tiger's advantage of a long-range gun, thick armor, was not completely nullified, but decreased considerably. American artillery was everywhere, all-powerful, omnipresent. German engineering half-tracks, the Sonderkampffahrzeug, so like 9 Defamo. It's an absolutely enormous thing.
I love Farmers. Seeing them at Millitracks is amazing. Yeah, I haven't been to Millitracks. I just see them on YouTube. But yeah,
I saw one at the Koblenz Technical Center in Koblenz in Germany. No pictures, sadly, are allowed to be taken there. But holy moly, it's a semi-truck essentially, and you need 3 of them to pull a Tiger. And fun fact, they're unarmored. So if you tell your engineers, hey, I lost my Tiger back there, can you guys go get it for me? As artillery is kind of pounding the vicinity of the Tiger, they are going to have some very choice words in your direction. And so a lot of the Tigers were lost with relatively minor damage just because they couldn't be recovered. There were attempts to pull a Tiger with another Tiger.
No good for the final drives.
Already, and so there's quite a comical situation where a company of Tigers was attacking. It crossed a railway embankment. The tanks tipped, obviously, as they were crossing this uneven terrain. They scooped up some dirt with their barrels. Okay, you need to stop and clean them out immediately. Turns out a company of Tiger tanks is actually a very obvious and tempting target because artillery started raining down on them. And the only actual damage that was sustained in that attack was a shell splinter pierced the radiator of one of the Tiger tanks. The Tiger overheated and had to be towed. Couldn't be towed by a FAMO, it had to be towed by another Tiger tank. That Tiger tank developed transmission trouble. These two tanks were then towed with 2 more Tiger tanks. Those 2 tanks developed transmission trouble, and so on and so forth. And it was this kind of snowball of technical problems where a whole company went out of action. And I'm going to skip to the end in the interest of time. They all had to be demolished. The whole company was lost because of this sort of insufficient technical support. And so the conclusion that the board comes to is Tiger is not yet sufficiently developed to be considered a reliable vehicle for long marches. He suffers from frequent suspension defects and probably also gearbox trouble. When pushed as in a retreat, these troubles are too frequent and serious for the German maintenance and recovery organization to deal with. Tiger killed himself. The interesting grammar is from the original. I didn't change it. This is 1944. The Tiger tank, at this point, I think when this report was written, the Tiger tank was already out of production. And they're saying the Tiger is not reliable yet. Well, that's a sort of spoiler. The Tiger was never reliable for the kind of long arduous marches that the Italian campaign required. And so, yeah, the Tiger just did not show itself well in Italy at all, and this actually gave the British a very overly optimistic view of what they would be like in Normandy. To their downfall. Although one can argue, and again, when they're in Normandy, the bigger threat is the Panther, I think, just kind of based on how often these tanks appear in documents. So not how often these tanks are mentioned by the frontline troops, because to them, Panther tank's a Tiger, a Strug is a Tiger, a captured Sherman is a Tiger. But on the higher-ups, the people who are writing the technical documents, they're worried about the Panther. You have all these new tests against the Panther because the British never captured their own, not until I think they had some in Italy. I can't remember, but it's either after the Normandy landings or just before. So the only Panther they had to go on was the one that they received from the USSR. So this kind of avalanche of Panthers was very new to them. And there were also many, many, many of them.
I was going to say the numerous nature of the Panther would have made it a much more immediate threat.
Right, yeah. And I have this document, which is a compilation of German POW interrogations, where the same questions would be asked of the Panther crews and Tiger crews. And the Tiger column is unfortunately very bare. A lot of the times they'll just say something like, probably same as Panther or insufficient evidence either way or something like that. And this would have been a tremendously useful document to have if it was fully filled out. I made as much use of it as I could, but unfortunately, even though the British did have to deal with quite a few Tigers in Normandy, enough for it to be an actual problem, new intelligence on the Tiger was not really prevalent, and I think it might be because they didn't really look for it. And really, the Tigers used in Normandy were not tremendously more different than Tiger 131 captured in North Africa. So I can see them prioritizing their technical intelligence branch on, the Panther, and then the King Tiger appeared shortly after, so they had plenty to do.
Fair enough.
Right.
Rob, have you got any other questions?
No, I think we've covered it all. Peter, thank you very much for joining us. Really appreciate your insight into how the Tiger was defeated. That's a good take.
Show us the book again, Peter.
Having me. It's
Achtung Tiger.
It's on Amazon. Google it. It'll be there. Remember, footnotes are bust.
Footnotes are bust. All right. Thank you. And we're back, folks. Look at that seamless transition.
That's
Look at that. I spent a week crying to make that happen, so I hope everyone appreciates it. And I realise most of our audience are on audio, and they'll never understand what just happened, but on the video, that was awesome. Okay, folks, I hope everyone enjoyed that.
I certainly did with Peter. He was very knowledgeable about the Tiger and where it's coming from and what's going on with it. So it was really enjoyable to talk to him this morning. It was a little bit early for both of us, but I think we're all right.
Yeah, we survived. We endured 8 a.m. on Saturday morning, although...
not our preferred time.
Yeah. Admittedly, I was awake at 3 because I'm looking after my parents' dog, who is a terrorist. Okay. Anyway, let's talk about tanks some more.
Thanks. Well,
Okay.
Are we doing? I think we've done the FT. Oh, we've got to refer to the poll, John.
Oh, yes, the poll on the FT. So the GOAT, as in the greatest of all time, 57%, and 43 saying okay for its time. And for a tank to be ranging between the best ever and okay...
Now, when you say for its time, you've got to remember, its time was 1917 to 1988.
Okay, well, let's remember they only built 84 in 1917 because they couldn't get fan belts before then. So it was really a 1918 tank despite its name. But it was absolutely, without doubt, the best tank in the world in 1918. And I would say remained the best tank in the world into the 20s.
Yep. Because nobody else had come up with anything better at that point in time.
I mean, to the point that, as we talked about earlier, the Renault R35 was not significantly better as a 1935 tank design.
No, certainly not.
Yeah.
All right. Some other fun stuff. John, so I decided, well, you know what? Doing study and writing scripts and so forth is really hard work. How can I make it easier? So I asked ChatGPT, write me a podcast script in the for Totally Tanked for an hour long about the Renault FT, and ChatGPT gave me very little new or exciting information, but one thing it did give me was that I'm Tank Tony. And
You're Tank Tony.
I'm Tank Tony, and you're Sherman Sally. They gave names to the two presenters. And
how do you know you're Tank Tony?
Because I was introducing it, and I started off there with the Tank podcast and Tankville.
All right, well, Sherman Sally is possibly a T-shirt coming up then. Hell, Tank Tony can be as well. No one ever buys the damn T-shirts these days, so it doesn't matter. But yeah, they're fun to put in the catalogue.
So at least I think we're safe from AI for now.
Well, in fact, actually, no. About a third of our T-shirt sales are us buying them because we want them.
Because John comes up with these great ideas, and I was like, "Oh, that looks cool. I'm going to buy one of those."
I'll do a Tank Tony and a Sherman Sally. I'll put that on my to-do list.
So until then, keep on tanking, and that's how ChatGPT ended their script.
Yeah.
Keep on tanking.
I know David Mitchell-Hill Green asked the Meta AI bot to describe Totally Tanked, and he let me know what it said. It was mostly just our blurb and bits and pieces. Well, it wasn't too bad. So Meta AI is ahead in describing us, but it's worth noting there is the aquarium supply shop and also the real estate agent in...
Tank.
Is it Kentucky?
No, it's Pennsylvania.
Anyway.
Pennsylvania.
Somewhere in rural America,
Pennsylvania's not... Well, actually, plenty of it.
He's in the rural bit. Anyway, love your tank. We've watched a bunch of your videos. You seem like a nice guy.
You promote your town really well. All right.
We'd love to have a beer with you.
They've got a number of little craft breweries in his town. Yeah, it'd be awesome to have a beer with you. Anyway, welcome to Tactical Gentlemen from the Netherlands. Glad you could join us. All right.
Hey. Well, we've finished the first half on the French, the Renault FT, so we're really addressing Tactical Gentlemen here. But we are about to talk about the second half of the show, which is where we get topical and current.
Like the rugby tipping comp.
Okay, let's talk about the rugby tipping comp, Rob.
All right, so
we've had a bunch of people from the podcast join our tipping comp this year, which has been lovely. We appreciate you guys.
So, being Canberrans, we are Brumby supporters.
Feral horse supporters, but yeah.
Feral horse supporters, yes, that's true.
Which is funny because this is a territory that shoots them on sight.
We don't shoot them on site.
Brumbies we do.
Yeah, no, we shoot
The
them
feral
as- 'cause
horses.
We shoot them in controlled eradication processes.
Yeah, but
which is what we do with kangaroos as well.
Every single... No, well, kangaroos, there are limits to how many we cull. Every single wild horse in the ACT gets shot.
I dispute that fact.
Anyway, go on.
That statement. I think because most of the ACT is national park. Canberra itself is a fifth of the territory.
Yeah, we have a large water catchment though, and wild horses are terrible for water catchments. Anyway, moving on.
All right, we do have a rugby tipping comp, and if you'd like to join us, we are totally tanks.
It's way too late in the season to join, but keep your powder dry for next season.
But I want to throw out that watching videos of the Fiat 3000 and the fascists who organised their demonstrations, something has to be said for the ability of the fascist governments to get crowds to turn up to events. Stadiums packed to see a bunch of tanks running through their paces, and I'd like to say...
So what is the Fiat 3000? Tell us about that.
That's the Italian FT.
Oh, right. Okay.
Yes. If only the Brumbies could get such crowds again.
Yes.
See,
Well, they have done a lot to ruin the faith of the community, but that is beyond the scope of this podcast.
So today they're playing. Right now they're playing, about to kick off against the Crusaders in the memorial match from when we last won the grand final back in 2004 that John and I were at.
Yes.
So 20 years ago, and
we were there the last time we beat them, and we were much younger. But they're having a terrible season, so come on. And also, a team...
The Crusaders are having a terrible season. The
Yeah.
Brumbies are having a great season.
Yeah, but also I just love that New Zealand can still produce a team calling itself the Crusaders and literally have a little castle built into their stadium and ride around on horses, swing swords, lopping off the heads of Muslims, which is the inherent message. I don't actually love that. I think it's kind of gross, and they should kind of move on from that. But I think it's funny.
If Dunedin be called the Highlanders, and who knows? And
Well, the Highlanders have not done the kind of oppression that Crusaders did. Being proud of Crusaders or even claiming to be part of a crusade is a little... You want to move on in this world. But anyway, Rob, let's keep trying.
All right. John.
Yes.
Palestinians. Are they people?
Are they people? So there's a reason why in this slideshow right now, for those on the video feed, I've got the cover art for the Black Mirror episode, which is on Netflix. And if you've never watched Black Mirror, do yourself a favor, just go out and watch all of that now. Charlie Brooker is an absolute genius, and Black Mirror episodes very frequently get optioned to be made into full-scale movies because Charlie Brooker's a genius. But season 3, the second last episode was called Men Under Fire, and the idea was that... Men Against Fire. That you put chips in the brains of your soldiers, and then all of the people that you send them out to shoot look like horrible cockroach monsters. And the episode's built around a guy whose chip's malfunctioning, and he realizes that he's actually dealing with people. And the point I'm just trying to make is the horrible things happening in Gaza and the protests happening around the world. There's a lot of people, because I still acknowledge them as being people, who are thinking that Palestinians and anyone who supports them are monsters of some sort. And if that's how you view the world, then you really need to correct your think. Well, you're just an asshole. Be an asshole if you want to be an asshole. Don't correct your thinking. Just be what you want to be. Anyway, that was all I was. I guess what I was trying to say there are tanks involved, and I've put something in the slideshow of children throwing rocks at tanks and dying is as a tank enthusiast, I find that upsetting.
Yep. Women and children who are not involved in conflicts do not need to be blown up and starved to death and everything else for tanks to be around. Yeah,
but I would also say that student protesters are annoying, and young student activists, and I have worked with a lot of them, are incredibly annoying, particularly once we get older. But the students in Vietnam were right. The students today protesting against the war in Gaza, or at least demanding that the educational institutions they pay enormous amounts of money to attend, maybe shouldn't, be funding, or investing in this conflict. I think history will regard them as being right, and you might want to consider where you want to stand on that. But let's move on from that now to talk more tank
in
stuff.
no way, in shape or form, supporting Hamas, who are a bunch of criminals, but taking out, committing genocide against a prison population of 2.3 million people is not a valid strategy for anybody.
Yeah, and just the lies being told. We all know it's lies. And you see Hillary Clinton, who's just the world's biggest loser, coming and saying, "Oh, these protesters don't know any history." And it's like, no, they know the history really well, and that's how they arrived at that conclusion. And Hillary Clinton, who took one of the most progressive countries in Africa in terms of Libya and turned it into a feudal slave-owning state, to be lecturing anyone about history is disgusting. And there you go, right-wing Americans, Hillary Clinton, disgusting. Have that as your takeaway.
All right.
Yeah.
Beer review. We're doing a proper beer review of the cast.
Beer review.
Now that we've had a chance to come back, because we miscalculated before about how much beer we were going to drink and how long the FT was going to go for. So, Korea's number one beer, John. Do you think?
Is that what it says it is?
That's what it says it is?
I thought Hite was, but I could be wrong. Okay. It says number one. They probably have something to back that up. I would say
It is.
it's good. It's a lager. It's just a lager. I saw this week a quote of Anthony Bourdain, God rest his soul, saying, "I hate beer snobs, just like I hate coffee snobs. But you know what I really like about beer? I like cold beer." And as someone who has worked for a number of years in the craft beer industry, I actually kind of see where he's coming from. And even when we were bring it back to tanks, when we were hanging out with the chieftain at Osama Fest, he was like, lagers are actually harder to make than ales, and I was like, yeah, I know that, mate.
He was always interested. He said how interested he was to try local beers wherever he went. So I thought that was really good.
But there's a thing where, particularly, we're men of a certain age, and
we're happy to pay for good beer.
Yeah, but not even that. We're paying for expensive bad beer is what we object to. And there's the craft beer industry is suffering an enormous contraction at the moment, and frankly, a lot of it is much deserved. But hopefully, some of the better breweries endure. Anyway, this beer just tastes like a really good lager. I'm pretty sure it's been bumped up with rice, which is a good way to make really nice lager, actually. It's been cold temperature brewed. Like they said, you got to. And the thing with lower temperatures, like if you want to use a Norwegian yeast, which is really high temperature, like you can brew those at 40 degrees centigrade, which is damn near 100 Fahrenheit, and then they'll brew out in a couple of days. This low temperature brewing takes 6 weeks, and then you're meant to cold store it for months. And the tank space and the storage space costs a brewery enormously, and it is still weird that the cheapest beers in the world are the most expensive to make, and the most expensive to make beers in the world. The cheapest to make beers are the more expensive ones. Anyway, goes to show, who knows how these things work.
God's work, mate.
God's
work. All right. Turtle tanks.
Turtle tanks. We've been loving them on our social media. So this is these basically building pig sheds over T-72s, and then bolting the mine roller on the front and sending them out to roll through the minefield.
And race madly towards the Ukrainian
I am astonished how quickly these things move with these pig sheds on their backs.
I'm not. It's just because it's not impeding their mobility. It's just impeding their vision.
Yeah, sure. But I mean, there's some weight. Anyway, the reason the Russians are putting these on their tanks is to keep FPV drones out of the, messing up their tanks. And that's valid. And it's mostly being used on the engineering vehicles that are trying to clear mines. So it's not taking a fighting tank out of the fight the way that putting this structure... Because the turret can't traverse more than, I don't know, maybe 30 degrees other side.
And the driver has no vision whatsoever. You can only see forward.
I don't think the driver's losing a lot from the standard driver's view, but the commander is definitely.
There's no
losing a lot.
situational awareness type thing.
But there should be some other tanks behind on the radio telling them what's going on.
Well, they'll be probably in contact with their own own drones, looking at the area, saying what they're going into.
But the point is, we're talking about a tank that's either running plows or rollers
and they're going fast. In case they're moving fast, so the artillery doesn't get them. So they're crossing the gap between the Russian lines to the Ukrainian lines as quick as they can, leading a couple of infantry fighting vehicles or APCs of Russian troops. So they race across as quick as they can and then stop and disgorge the troops, fire a few rounds, and then race off as fast as they can before the artillery starts coming in.
Now, I have seen a Russian description, take it with a grain of salt, of one of these turtle tanks being assaulted by a wave of 40 FPV drones. Now, first thing I'm going to say is 40 FPV drones probably can't exist in the same space at the same time, so this wave had to have been staged out over time, and I say that because the command circuits can't communicate with the drones.
And they also have the anti-drone jammers.
I'm about to talk about the jammers. Yeah, they got jammers on top. So this one case, there were 40 drones in this wave, which I don't know how many minutes the wave was, but I'm guessing they were staged out a bit. 32 of them the jammers took out. So they just dropped out of the sky because the jammers cut off their command circuits. 8 of them hit the sides of the pig shed. And the in that case the turtle tank rumbled on, but there's definitely a lot of evidence of turtle tanks getting destroyed because, as we just talked, even the mighty Tiger in World War II could be destroyed. The first tank in the world to rumble out there in 1916 at the Battle of the Somme could be destroyed. Tanks can be destroyed. This is not surprising. It's about the effects they bring and the cost to the enemy of disrupting them.
And the time it takes to change your tactics in order to counter the enemy activity. So getting inside the enemy's OODA loop, which is the observe, orient, act, decide, whatever it is.
Decide, act. Yeah.
Decide, act. I've forgotten all these things. Maybe I wouldn't blame the CAS.
The OODA loop is and John Boyd's theories. There's some merit to them, but I don't think they're the be all and end all.
But they're a nice, easy thing to get into.
Yeah. Anyway, that's fine. Anyway, the turtle tanks have definitely been a big thing in Russia. They are a part of the way the Russians are really rumbling over the top of the Ukrainians. If we're going to talk rugby, and let's talk about Ukraine specifically, as a rugby fan, what you often see is a team that is totally overmatched, but are not a bunch of losers. They can hang on for the first 30 or 40, 50 minutes of the game.
Yeah. It's the championship minutes of the last 20 minutes of the game where the fitness levels between your good amateurs versus your professionals really kick over.
But even if it's not fitness, even if the teams are equal on fitness, but one team is just bigger and stronger than the other, for the first bit of the game, the smaller team can hang on, but eventually they get tired. And what we're seeing in Ukraine right now is the Russians are moving the fronts around, moving the axis of threat, forcing the Ukrainians to pull reserves from one area to the other, and it's not going to end well for Ukraine. What we're seeing right now, what I'm pretty sure is, and we've got a slide up of Antony Blinken, for God's sake.
For those who don't know, he's the US Secretary of State.
He's
the man who runs around the world and tries to make treaties and tells people what the US is going to do for them.
But he turned up in Kyiv and he convinced a band to let him on stage with a guitar to play with them. And they thought Neil Young was going to play, but instead it was Antony Blinken playing Neil Young. And Rockin' in the Free World is one of my favourite songs. But if you know the song, it's not positive about the West and the free world. Neil Young is a cranky, very old lefty. There's lines in there, I don't feel like Satan, but I am to them. Anyway, it was extremely cringe. And what I'm getting out of this is that the Americans just do not want Ukraine to collapse before November when the US presidential election happens. And they have no interest in keeping it going past that.
And you were saying before about that's one of the reasons why that we believe that they've convinced Ukraine to not hold their own elections this year. So they've suspended those because wartime.
And to be fair, Britain in World War II suspended their elections. It is not terrible for democracies to suspend their elections during times of crisis. That is something that is extremely normal, going all the way back to the darkest days of Athens and Sparta. The issue is that it ain't so much of a free world if you're not having elections, but also the poor bloody Ukrainians. And I keep saying this, and I did want to say, everyone needs to be really nice to their pro-Ukraine fans, because this is going to be a really tough time for those folks.
It's going to be a hard summer for them.
Yeah.
Bringing it back closer to home, in the ACT here, the other day we had our own situation of David McBride. He was a whistleblower for Australian Army.
We've never jailed a war criminal, but we jailed the whistleblower war criminal.
Yeah. So, yes, he got sentenced on Monday or Tuesday, and he's getting 5 years and 8 months. Parole after 2 years, something or other. But basically, it really is the fact of the only person who's been jailed for war crimes.
And Australia committed many war crimes in Afghanistan.
In Afghanistan was the whistleblower who said, "Hey guys, how about we not condone these sort of things?"
Look, the details of it get a lot more complicated.
They are very complicated. The reason why he brought the information forward and the response to them, but in the end of the day...
And I've met David McBride.
Have you?
I have, and he's a complicated man, would be what I say. But I would, in his defence, I would say if you've been subjected to the full force of the state the way he has, you're not going to be completely rational in all your decisions at the end of that. He initially started making leaks. Just unauthorized disclosures of classified information, which is what he's been convicted for, because he actually thought that the soldiers who committed the war crimes were being hung out to dry by the high command, and he didn't approve of that. Which is just how complicated these things get, really.
But at the end of the day, the person who was trying to bring to light the situation has been hounded and then sentenced and
imprisoned. And none of the people who actually shot the civilians and drank beer out of their prosthetic legs, which has actually happened, none of them are in prison.
No, and at the end of the day, he's going to be the one who's suffering from all this, rather than and it's basically the Australian government going forth to ensure that he got persecuted, whatever you want to say.
Well, he's been in prison now.
Yeah. But persecuted towards this without... they could have stopped it. They could have stopped it any stage they want, but they said we need to... They obviously need to carry out this to ensure that no other whistleblowers come forward, because they know that whistleblowers will end up with the full force of the law against them with anything that the government tries to doesn't want to get out there.
Indeed.
And I think, boys and girls,
we are at the end of our longest episode ever.
Is this longer than the Churchill?
I think so.
Maybe. Maybe by 2 minutes.
It's been a long one.
Yeah.
Okay, so thanks, folks, who've listened through.
Go back to the poll. The poll has changed in the last
poll has changed.
15 minutes.
62% reckon it's the GOAT. Renault FT, the GOAT.
The GOAT for its time.
Totally tank.
The GOAT for its time, I want to say.
Yes. We have declared the Renault FT the greatest tank ever, which, we often think Centurion is. It's a close one. Obviously, Centurion would just drive over the top of a Renault FT.
Like a Mr. Bean episode. That was a chieftain, I know, but... Same sort of thing.
The Renault FT could be popping away if the Centurion noticed it, boom. But we got to bring it back to the time and the context, and the Renault FT is amazing.
Yep.
Okay, on that note, folks, we really appreciate your company, and we will be back in a month with another tank. Who knows what we could go?
Who knows? And who knows what beer Rob will bring then?
Yeah, but it's a bit terrifying, Rob, because when we go back to World War One, we can go anywhere next. Oh, yeah. All right, thank you, folks, for listening. We will be back, and special thanks for the patrons again. Okay, see you, folks.